Chapter 281, Lies. The wizards from the Kema Duchy were vaguely polite toward Saul. Whether it was because of the wizard tower backing him or for some other reason, no one could say for sure. Since Yura had thrown a tantrum and locked herself in a private carriage, they invited Saul to rest inside their carriage instead. But Saul, now just one step away from becoming a third-rank apprentice, had no mind for social niceties. "Thank you, but there's no need. Can you tell me what actually happened here?" Barry, however, hesitated. Just then, a sharp bird cry rang out in the sky, and almost everyone tilted their heads to look upward. Moments later, a giant, deep brown eagle descended from the sky. It hovered about 10 meters above the ground. The rider on its back didn't dismount but leaned over the side and shouted down to Saul, "That guy ran off again. Do you know where he might be headed?" Saul shook his head. Kira pouted. "What the hell is Kismet doing on the western continent? He's like a vulture drawn to the scent of blood. So annoying." "So you do know his name," Saul scoffed inwardly. "Then why did you keep calling him Silverhair? Kismet's probably driven half mad by you." She asked Saul again, "So how did you end up with him?" "After I escaped from the town." Bang! The carriage door was flung open again, crashing hard against the frame. "This is tower business. No need for an outsider like you to interfere." Lady Yura was still inhabiting that puppet body. Even though she could only blink and move her mouth, her face stiff and expressionless, the chill radiating off her made it crystal clear how angry she was. Only Kira dared talk back to her. "Some princess from Kina's sent here for a political marriage walked into that town and is now nothing but bones. Of course I'm going to question Saul. Even if Gorsa were here, he wouldn't say a word. You try jumping around again, and I'll split open that shell you're hiding in." The joints of Yura's puppet body creaked ominously, but she said nothing more. The aura of a second-rank wizard wasn't something to trifle with. Saul quickly recounted what had happened after he entered the town, at least the parts he could afford to reveal. The court wizards from the Kema Duchy, standing nearby, were visibly chilled by the tale. The wizard tower had actually lost a second-rank apprentice and 2 third-rank apprentices in there. Fortunately, they'd waited for Grand Duke Kira to arrive before going into the town to retrieve people. Had anyone rushed in ahead of time last night, they likely would have become part of that bloody town themselves. But toward the end of Saul's account, the Kema wizards began to express doubts about parts that seemed unclear. "Lord Saul," said Court Wizard Barry, his tone still respectful but tinged with obvious suspicion, "if that girl Penny was tricking people into dying, why would she help you escape?" Saul didn't get angry. He understood that anyone in their position would feel skeptical. "First, I saw through the so-called escape route. It was a trap. She couldn't fool me. Second, I struck a deal with her in exchange for my freedom." Another court wizard frowned, clearly not buying it and about to speak when Kira cut him off. "That's enough. He's Gorsa's personally trained apprentice. What's the point of pressing him so hard?" At the mention of Gorsa, the whole scene fell silent. That man was one of the top second-rank wizards on the western continent, and more importantly, completely unreasonable. Forget whether Saul was hiding anything. Even if he'd slaughtered the whole town himself, who would dare question him? What you need to concern yourself with is already clear. The princess from Kina's entered the town after Saul. Whether they were tricked or walked in on their own doesn't matter anymore. They're all dead. Tell the Grand Duke of Kina's to either stop wasting time sending princesses and start sending gold, or if he wants someone to take the blame, go after Kismet. He's a rogue second-rank wizard running around wreaking havoc. Kira glanced at Saul again. She clearly knew he was hiding something. But whether Saul had used underhanded means or was simply concealing his spoils, Kira didn't care. Gorsa's stance had already made things clear. He valued Saul highly. Kiera had no reason to make things difficult for him over some foreign princess. I'm heading back. Clean up this place and keep the corruption from spreading. With that, Kiera gave the birds back a light pat. The giant eagle let out a sharp cry and flapped its wings, soaring away from Grindsail Town. The remaining people all looked at Saul with a hint of fear in their eyes. They didn't fear Saul himself, but the man behind him, Gorsa. Wizard Barry, the first to speak, now stood opposite Saul, as uncomfortable as if 1,000 bugs were crawling over him. "If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave now," Saul said with a polite smile, bidding farewell to the Kema delegation. The mood on the other side instantly lightened, and everyone looked ready to cheerfully see him off. Trying to smooth things over, Wizard Barry offered Saul a more luxurious carriage for the journey. But Saul declined. He returned to his own carriage and found Lady Yura still looking displeased. Angry women were not to be trifled with. Saul lowered his presence and asked respectfully, "Vinny, should we head back now? There are still some details about the town I'd like to explain to you." The unspoken meaning. There were things he couldn't say to the others, but Yura needed to know. The puppet's tight lips suddenly relaxed. She tilted her head slightly and said in a soft voice, "Get in." Before leaving, Saul entrusted the mad old man to Wizard Barry. Barry, eager to ease tensions, would surely take good care of him. He might never be cured of his madness, but at least he'd live comfortably for the rest of his life. Though Saul outranked Barry in status, he was far less experienced when it came to managing worldly affairs. He even reminded Barry not to give the old man any flashy treatment, just let him live a peaceful life. Wizard Barry accepted the disheveled old man from Saul's mage hand and solemnly promised to do as instructed. Just as Saul turned to leave, he heard the old man mumble under his breath. The butterfly flew away. Saul paused for a second, and Penny's voice and face flashed through his mind. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, his face had returned to calm. The carriage started moving, but they weren't headed back to the Wizard Tower just yet. They were going to Black Castle first, to handle the inheritance left by Machi Machi. In the carriage, Saul recounted the deaths of Machi Machi and Angela in detail, and emphasized that it would be difficult for Billy to have escaped the town. "Madam, did you see Billy escape when you were outside the town?" "I did," Yura admitted bluntly. "It was because Billy came out while Wright and I were near the gates that Wright got dragged back into Grindsail." So Wright had been dragged to his death by Billy. The Kema delegation had already confirmed there were no survivors in the town. Though the flesh-blood corruption was still contained within the walls for now, without careful handling, it would soon spread and spark a massive blood-soaked panic. A curse that not even a third-rank apprentice could escape, could easily wipe out an entire large town. So as Saul and Yura departed, the Kema delegation remained behind to continue containment. "So did Billy get away?" Saul asked. "He ran off," Yura said offhandedly, fiddling with the frills of her puppet maid's skirt. "After he used Wright as a scapegoat, he didn't dare face me and just fled. Not that I care. I'd already gotten everything I needed from Wright." Saul lowered his gaze. He'd seen people pull this kind of stunt before, using others as sacrifices to save themselves. If he hadn't stayed alert and made preparations in advance to counter such betrayals, who knew if he'd still be sitting here now? The wizarding world was like that. Either you pursued knowledge or you pursued profit. Those who chased knowledge would die for it. Those who chased profit would kill others for it. Chapter 282, Marking. Saul gave Wright a 3-second moment of silence, then asked, "Why were you inside Wright Rarnell's body, madam? Didn't you tell me Wright might have been controlled by the land drifters? I came out to meet up with him and track them down, and along the way, I confiscated a bunch of goodies they'd prepared both in secret and out in the open. If they dare reach into the wizard tower, then they'd better be ready to have their whole arm chopped off. Wright probably hadn't expected that what started as a classic undercover counterattack arc would end in his sudden, accidental death. Turns out, even for a third-rank apprentice, this world is still terrifyingly dangerous. You still haven't told me, why did that Penny let you out? Because she's a nightmare butterfly, and I have one of her cocoons. Nightmare butterfly. Yura showed a flicker of confusion on her face. She didn't know what a nightmare butterfly was. That didn't seem right. As a soul who studied the dark element, she should have at least heard of it. Especially since his current focus was on resurrection, an academic field closely tied to soul-type entities. I'm not exactly clear on the nightmare butterfly's attributes, Saul admitted, but I know it can alter a person's perception of themselves and of the world. Haywood definitely knew more about this sort of thing, so Saul couldn't just pretend to be totally clueless. Oh, as expected, Yura perked up. Are you selling it? Saul remained composed and shook his head lightly. It's not that I won't sell it, it's that I can't. Yura frowned. It's part of the terms for you leaving that little town, isn't it? Smart. What kind of deal did you make? Saul merely stared at her in silence. Yura looked visibly annoyed. She leaned back in her seat. If you signed anything problematic, just go tell Gorsa. He always has some weird tricks up his sleeve. She folded her arms and sat there quietly for a moment, then suddenly looked up again. So why were you in that town? I was originally heading for Borderfall City, but when I passed through, I remembered my friend. I went to check in and discovered they had. You mean that lunatic you brought back? Saul paused, then shook his head. No, that was my friend's neighbor. The carriage rolled on in silence. Since they weren't in a huge rush, it was already past noon when the group reached Black Castle on the outskirts of Borderfall City. But as Saul arrived, he saw the once slender tower had withered overnight, as if aged by time and weather. The outer walls were flacking and crumbling in large patches. What happened? Saul stood before the gate. Even the eye that used to be embedded in the door was nowhere to be seen. There was a vine inside Black Castle, one that Machi Machi raised. He infused it with his mental energy. Now that he's dead, it couldn't survive either. Yura walked up and pushed the door open, heading down the narrow hallway. Even the once opulent Grand Hall was now shrouded in darkness, as if it too had died with its former master. Yura seemed familiar with the place. She led Saul downward until they reached a wine cellar. Though called a cellar, there wasn't even a trace of wine. Instead, the air smelled more like something had rotted. They walked all the way to the end of the cellar, where Yura pushed open a hidden door. This entrance had no tidy stone steps, just a dirt path. When Yura stepped forward, the damp soil nearly reached the top of her shoes. She seemed like she wanted to frown, but her doll-like face couldn't display that much emotion. Saul followed behind, observing everything carefully. This was a place he hadn't set foot in during either of his previous visits. He could almost feel tiny droplets suspended in the air, sliding into his lungs with each breath. It was damp, stifling. The passage had the same narrow design as the tower above, and walking through it, Saul and Yura resembled two burrowing moles. After descending dozens of meters, they finally encountered something other than dirt. Tiny, glowing white mushrooms began appearing in the corners of the tunnel, strangely familiar looking. Eventually, the sloping tunnel began to level out. And then a massive black shadow loomed ahead. It was the vine's root system. Enormous, thick roots still lay buried deep in the earth. Black Castle needs a temporary master, Yura said, her glowing fingers casting light into the dark burrow. Otherwise, the upper part of the tower will collapse before long. Inject your mental energy and become the temporary master of Black Castle. Me. Of course, I'm heading back soon, and only you can stay here for now. Yura shifted her body, her back nearly pressed against the dirt wall to make room for Saul. Saul stepped forward and placed a hand on the thick root. In the next moment, he seemed to hear a voice. Is Machi Machi dead? Yes. He was the master who stayed with me the longest. And how long will you last? I hate changing masters. It's uncomfortable. Yura, arms crossed and expressionless, said flatly, Tell it this. At most 10 days, no more than 15, someone from the tower will come. If it can afford to wait, fine. But the second vault certainly can't. Saul gave a slight nod and relayed, I'm just a temporary caretaker. Someone will take over within 15 days. So annoying. I don't like temporary masters, but fine. What choice do I have if I can't last 15 days myself? Stinky brat, push your mental energy in. Try not to puke, it's an acquired taste. Saul raised an eyebrow. Sounds like being the Black Castle's temporary master isn't going to be a pleasant experience. The diary in his soul body remained unchanged. Narrowing his eyes, Saul channeled his mental energy through his fingers into the vine root, which was over 3 meters thick. Instantly, a massive force surged into his mind. In that moment, Saul felt as if his senses were fused with the vine. He could feel the roots beneath his feet absorbing moisture and nutrients through tiny pores in the soil. He felt the vine writhing and growing underground, breaking through to spots of sunlight and air. But more than that, he felt an overwhelming sense of constraint. It was growing, yes, but it was also tightly bound, unable to deviate from its set path, not an inch beyond. Saul's brows slowly furrowed. The sensation was unbearable, like being wrapped tightly in bandages, limbs crushed together. And when you tried to move, you realized there was an iron coffin outside the bandages, holding you utterly still. It was worse than suffocation. It was despair. Saul wanted to scream, to vent the pressure, but even his lips couldn't part. Are you done yet? Yura's questioning voice broke through the haze. Saul snapped his eyes open. Every cell in his body finally felt released. The terrible pressure vanished. And yet, just the memory of it was enough to make him shudder. What's wrong? You have a strong mental aptitude. It shouldn't be that hard for you. Saul lowered his hand. He could now faintly sense the goings-on around the tower above him. Who approached, who wandered inside, he could feel it all. It's marked, Saul told her. Only then did Yura relax. You stood there for so long, I thought something went wrong. The marking process wasn't exactly comfortable. Of course not, but with your strength, it was already much easier than it would have been for others. Was it? Still reeling, Saul couldn't even imagine how much worse it could have been. One thing was for sure. After what he just experienced, he wasn't eager to go through it again anytime soon. Chapter 283. The guest becomes the host. As Saul successfully marked the vine with his mental signature, everything around them slowly began to come back to life. The vine obediently extended its roots deeper into the soil, and even the dampness within the underground passage began to gradually dissipate. A small white mushroom even sprouted beneath Saul's right foot. Looks like the elder vine really recognized you. I can feel Black Castle recovering quickly, Yura said, gazing upward. All right, let's get out of here. It's too damp. I think this body's joints are about to grow mold. Saul was still observing the changes around him, but at her words, he slowly lifted his foot to follow. This vine beneath the Black Castle truly was something strange. As Saul began to move away from the root system, he could feel one particularly active root suddenly sprout from the main body, following his footsteps as he walked. Every time his foot landed, it felt as though it touched the root through a thin layer of soil. Saul found it fascinating. He raised his right hand and reached out toward one of the walls. Immediately, the root system split in two. One branch rapidly and playfully extended upward, and just as his palm touched the soil on the side, a small tip popped up and gave him a gentle high five. Whoa, Saul chuckled with amusement, and immediately raised his left hand toward the opposite wall. The root split again, growing even faster to meet his left palm under the soil. Palm touched root once more. Heh, Saul couldn't help but laugh aloud this time. Ahead of him, Yura turned around in confusion. The puppet's head twisted all the way backward. What are you doing? Saul suddenly realized how childish his actions must have looked. Especially to someone else, he probably seemed like an idiot playing around. Ahem. He awkwardly withdrew both hands and discreetly wiped the dirt off his fingertips. I was just feeling the vine's changes. I definitely wasn't taking the root for a walk. Yura gave him a suspicious look, then turned her head back forward after a few seconds. Her neck joint made a creaking noise like wood rubbing together. Maybe she really was growing mold. The two of them left the underground cavern, exited through the wine cellar, and shut the secret door behind them. It was only then that Saul completely lost contact with the root system underground. However, after he and Yura left, the root, once quietly growing beneath the earth, suddenly trembled weakly but noticeably. Who exactly is he? Why did a mere mental connection allow him to take over my entire body? The faint voice was no longer impatient like when it had just spoken to Saul. Instead, it quivered slightly, mirroring the subtle trembling of its physical form. And who are you? What did that boy leave inside me? No one answered. What? The puppet body housing Yura's soul was really falling apart now, and not just in the sense of growing mold. Her whole movement had begun to slow down. I'm heading back now. I'm requisitioning your coachman, Yura said, speeding up her steps, though even her hip joint was beginning to make strange noises. Vinny, are you all right? Do you need me to do anything? I'm fine. There's something inside this puppet body I didn't expect. I need to get back and clean it out. No need to see me off. With that, Yura pushed open the castle's main gate and bolted out like the wind. Outside, the coachman was still waiting in place, squatting beside the road and examining the wild grass. Suddenly, he felt a gust of wind sweep into the carriage, followed by a voice so phlegmy it sounded like it was wrapped in mucus. Back to the tower. Startled, the coachman stood up at once, only to find Saul still standing at the gate, not having gotten in. The boy's expression was a little dazed and uncertain. Saul nodded slightly at him, gesturing for him to depart. Only then did the coachman scramble into the driver's seat, bow slightly toward Saul, and drive the carriage swiftly away from Black Forest. Now, Saul was the only one left in the entire Black Castle. He turned and saw that on the long, narrow door of the castle, where an eye had once been, a black tendril had suddenly stretched out. It looked very familiar. Little Algie, Saul immediately reached behind his neck. A small, black tendril extended from there, wrapping briefly around Saul's index finger before quickly releasing and retracting. When did little Algie sneak in there? Wait, don't tell me the one playing patty cake with me in the soil earlier was you. Realizing this, Saul quickly returned to the underground passage. As soon as he stepped through the wine cellar's hidden door again, he noticed something was different. The air was still damp, but no longer suffocating. The ground had become looser and slightly muddy underfoot. When Saul reached the thick vine from before, he was shocked to find it had already slimmed down a size in just a few minutes. Little Algie, Saul called out to it. No, I am not. But if by that you mean the black tendril that took root in my body, I believe it is trying to respond to you. As the deep voice fell silent, several black tendrils suddenly grew out of the soil around Saul. It felt just like the abandoned underground laboratory beneath the wizard tower again, where corpses floated on the surface and giant tendrils as thick as barrels stretched out. Saul looked down and stomped his foot again. The ground squished under him, sticky and slightly sunken. It really was becoming more and more like a swamp. Why did little algae move into your body? Was that not your doing? Just now, when you connected to me with your mental power, whimper. Wait, was this big guy crying? Your powerful mental energy exceeded the bounds of the connection and took over my entire body. After patrolling through the forest and the castle, you retreated. But you left behind little algae. It's now frantically devouring my nutrients. Saul was dumbfounded. So that stifling, imprisoned feeling earlier wasn't just from the mental link. It was because he'd mentally groped this thing from top to bottom. And then, before leaving, left behind an uninvited guest who took over the house and started raiding the pantry. Could you maybe control it a little? At this rate, my extremities will wither and the whole castle will collapse. Little algae, Saul called after a moment of silence. A thin black tendril emerged from the back of his neck and opened a shark-like mouth at him, clacking its teeth with a caw-caw-caw. Take it easy, don't eat too much. We're going to be staying here for at least 10 more days. Little algae happily nodded and retracted again. Saul turned back to the vine root. Is that better now? Thank you for your generosity. I also apologize for my rudeness when we first met. It's fine, Saul said, leaving the vine where it was. Perhaps because of the new owner, the atmosphere within the Black Castle was different now. The tall, narrow buildings began to seem less grotesque, more in line with Saul's aesthetic tastes. He didn't bother finding Machi Machi's room and simply entered a guest room at random, sitting on a long, narrow bed that looked more like a coffin. The carriage trip takes 10 days at least, so for now it's just me here. Saul thought of the bag of grinding sound fruits he'd managed to bring from Grind Sale Town. Honestly, there's no need to return to the tower. I can completely rebuild a mental realm formation right here. This is my turf now. Chapter 284, Efficiency. 2 days later, Saul finally completed the construction of the mental realm formation in the Black Castle's laboratory, using the experimental tools and a portion of the magic crystals left behind by Machi Machi. Afterward, he walked over to another lab bench on the other side of the room. Bending down, he brought his line of sight parallel with a distillation apparatus on the table. On one end of the apparatus, a round-bottom flask was bubbling under a magic flame. On the other end, a conical beaker had already accumulated a thin layer of dark gray liquid. The dosage is sufficient, but the purification method is fairly primitive, so it might not do much to enhance the potion's emotion-stabilizing effect. Still, I don't have many of the fruits left. Using a more aggressive method risks unnecessary losses. Unlike the object modification experiment, refining the grinding sound fruit solution didn't carry the risk of death. The diary wouldn't offer Saul any help with it either. Even if Saul threatened the diary, saying he'd hang himself if the experiment failed, it wouldn't make a difference. The diary knew full well he wouldn't do it. As for little algae, it was no help in this experiment either. Despite being an earth attribute creature, it was peculiarly more sensitive to spiritual entities. So after weighing his options, Saul opted for a more conservative experimental approach. However, to maximize the solution's purity, he had to extend the duration of the experiment, ensuring every step was executed with precision. During the 2 days he waited, Saul kept himself busy. Machi Machi's study still had some magic notes, while the truly valuable ones had been sealed away with magic. Since Machi Machi had been the original owner of the Black Castle, and the study was off-limits to outsiders, he'd left the books that were available for internal borrowing casually on the shelves. Conveniently, since Machi Machi also specialized in dark attribute magic, the bookshelf held just what Saul needed: a second-tier spell. There were 2 volumes in total. After a moment of indecision, Saul immediately chose one to begin studying. Second-tier magic, Touch of Torment. It happened to be the upgraded version of the first-tier spell Frost Touch that Saul already knew. Saul's second pick was a tentacle type. He didn't pick the tentacle type spell because he had any special fondness for tentacles. It was mainly because he had little algae with him. Tentacle type magic combined with little algae made for unpredictable and effective attacks, just like how he had taken on the disguised Kismet at the Ralph Manor. So Saul simultaneously studied Touch of Torment, constructed the mental realm formation, and waited for the refined grinding sound fruit solution to fuse. Now 2 of the 3 tasks were finally complete. Saul withdrew the magic crystal, extinguished the flame, and disconnected the tube linking the 2 beakers. Finally, he carefully poured the solution from the conical beaker into a test tube. Once inside the test tube, the dark gray liquid began to deepen toward black, evidently a sign of excessive purity triggering inevitable oxidation upon exposure to air. Saul hastened his steps, carrying the test tube into the formation. Taking a deep breath, he stood at the formation's center. As usual, he drank a dose of Heart's Guard before swallowing the grinding sound fruit extract. The moment it entered his mouth, Saul felt as if he had swallowed a chunk of ice. The ice continuously absorbed heat, freezing his esophagus and stomach completely. The chill seeped into the walls of his throat, muscle, fat, and blood, then rode the bloodstream all the way to his brain. All his anxiety and tension dissolved in an instant. He felt like a puppet, utterly devoid of emotion. Fortunately, Saul's memories remained intact. The extracted juice is twice as potent as the raw grinding sound fruit, but Saul didn't rush to activate the formation. He closed his eyes and recalled several names, friends and enemies alike, yet not a single one stirred his emotions. Moments later, he opened his eyes, adjusted his magic and mental energy, and the entire room instantly froze. Smoke and dust stopped swirling. Even the faint whisperings within the walls fell silent. In the next second, the world shattered like a mirror, revealing a bizarre starry sky behind it. Beneath his feet was a gray, rock-like circular platform, inscribed with the formation Saul had drawn himself. All around was tranquil darkness, twinkling with countless stars. At first glance, it looked no different from the last time he entered the mental realm. But when Saul lifted his right hand, a deep red hardcover book immediately appeared in his palm. The diary hovered 5 centimeters above his hand and flipped open in accordance with his will. The first page was still gold, but nothing happened. As expected, even a third-rank apprentice can't use the golden page. From what I've seen in the diary's recorded history, the golden page has never appeared before. But based on the visuals, the diary appears to possess the ability to bring death to all beings. The golden page likely relates to that power. With his emotions suppressed, Saul didn't feel even a trace of disappointment. Calmly, he had the diary flipped to the front half of the white pages. He began comparing the handwriting of past entries he had seen to the unfamiliar ones present on the pages. Saul didn't know how long the diary's writing would persist, but after reviewing dozens of white pages with different handwriting styles, he still found nothing that matched the script in his memory. Possibility 1. The older texts are overwritten. That would mean the diary functions like surveillance footage. Old videos get replaced by new ones. Possibility 2. I still lack the qualifications, and the diary refuses to display that text. Still unbothered, Saul flipped to the black pages. Each time he opened a black page, he lightly flicked it with his finger, sending the page flying away. 3 pages landed on the stone platform, transforming into Agu, Morden, and Herman. Master, Master, Master. Among the 3, Herman called out the loudest and most resolutely. Ever since Saul had replenished Herman's soul energy during his breakdown, the man had stood firmly by Saul's side. Even after regaining his sanity, he hadn't wavered in the slightest. His unhesitating loyalty only made the slower reactions of Agu and Morden seem lukewarm by comparison. Herman is fully under control, Morden 70%, Agu just over 50. Saul did the math in his head, his expression still devoid of emotion. He had the three of them wait and turned to the fourth black page. Last time, this page was still incomplete, but after absorbing the wraith hidden in Angela's left hand back in Grind Sale Town, it had become whole. He didn't know what kind of soul consciousness this completed page would now summon. Saul tilted his chin, motioning for the three spirits to stand at his side. Then, with a flick of his hand, he sent the fourth black page flying. However, when the black page hit the ground, it transformed into someone completely unexpected. Angela. The 14-year-old girl had lively eyes, a slender frame, and even her small chest had begun to show some shape. The only thing off about her was the fact that she had 6 arms. Master Tilda. Perhaps hearing the others call him that, the girl followed suit as soon as she appeared. 2 hands rested under her chin, 2 twirled a lock of hair, and the last 2 shyly pinched at the hem of her clothes. She was the very picture of a bashful, coquettish young girl, executing the entire performance to perfection. Chapter 285, New Soul. Who exactly are you? Angela, the wraith hand, or the original half-bodied woman? Saul fixed his gaze on the 6-armed Angela, staying on high alert in case she launched a sudden attack. But the 6-armed Angela simply stood there obediently, her expression betraying a deep-seated fear even under Saul's faintly tempting tone. She feared Saul more than any of the other 3 soul fragments. Answering Master, I am currently more of a fused entity. At present, the dominant consciousness is that of the severed hand. Under Saul's emotionless stare, Angela gradually stiffened, and finally, all 6 of her hands quietly folded down and pressed themselves against her sides. There was originally a soul here whose consciousness was completely in chaos, but she possessed a great deal of energy, very special energy. The most astonishing thing is that the source of the corruption which caused her madness has now completely vanished. Of course, this also led to the erasure of a large portion of her consciousness. As a result, though I was once weaker than her, I've now become the dominant mind. Then what's with this appearance of Angela? Saul asked, pressing on. The girl in front of him nervously wrung her hands. I stayed in Angela's body for a long time, and her consciousness left an impression on me. And I also liked her appearance. I thought maybe Master would too. Saul paid no attention to her deliberate attempt to curry favor. He was deep in thought, trying to figure out how this 6-armed version of Angela had come to be. Of the 4 soul fragments currently remaining in the diary, Agu and Herman had normal human forms. But Morden and Angela, one had dozens of mismatched legs, and the other now had 6 hands. They were all conglomerations of multiple soul consciousnesses, seemingly forcefully fused together by the diary. And the diary's most powerful function lay in this. It fused soul fragments while forcibly purging any corruption. What if the diary was used on the soul of a living person? Like a wizard on the verge of collapse from study and corruption, could it achieve the same effect? After a moment, Saul shook his head and rejected his own idea. The diary doesn't reverse corruption, it simply carves it out by force. If used on a living person, even if it saved their life, it would likely leave their soul incomplete. This method mustn't be used recklessly. Setting that train of thought aside, Saul continued to examine the state of the 6-armed Angela. Since you're now a fusion of 3 consciousnesses, do you possess all 3 sets of memories? Not all of them, Angela replied, searching through her mind. The act itself caused her to wince. The original chaotic consciousness only left behind a few scattered memories buried deep within this mind. When I try to recall them, I feel pain and rage. Who had that fragment of a soul, torn from Ralph's laboratory, originally belonged to? That question was now impossible to answer. Everyone related to Ralph, and the Bloodthorn family had been completely wiped out. Not even a trace of their souls remained. For now, don't try to recall the memories of that original consciousness. If the source of its corruption lies in those memories, then trying to remember them could put you in danger. Understood. The six-armed Angela immediately nodded obediently, abandoning any attempt to probe deeper into that memory. What about your memories as the Wraith Hand, or the ones from when you were alive? Do you still have those? A trace of sorrow passed over Angela's face. Perhaps due to Angela's own lingering influence, she bit her lip and instinctively made a pitiful expression. I spent most of my time in the interlayer in a state of confusion. I could only stay sane by devouring fragments of other soul entities. It was only after I came into contact with Angela that I began to slowly recover. But most of my previous memories are already gone. I only remember that I was once an apprentice at the Wizard Tower. I don't even remember my name. Due to the diary's restrictions, none of the four soul fragments could lie to Saul, so he believed the Wraith Hand genuinely had no memories of her past. But Saul didn't think it was merely a matter of memory loss. The fact that she appeared only as a hand suggested that the rest of her may have already been devoured by other souls. And what about Angela? How much of her consciousness remains? Just a few memory fragments, mostly about her family. As for her memories of the Wizard Tower, they're much less clear. But she didn't need memories of the Wizard Tower. Whether it was Kaz's lab or other places, the Wraith Hand knew them far better than Angela ever did. You've just recently fused these three consciousnesses. If anything else changes later, make sure to let me know immediately. He repeated this instruction to the other three soul fragments as well. Things are different now. Before, you couldn't observe the outside world or speak out on your own. But starting today, I'll grant you permission to observe the outside at appropriate times. If anything urgent happens, you can now communicate directly through the diary. This was a new ability Saul had just unlocked after entering the mental realm again. Or perhaps more accurately, it was a discovery. Ever since the diary became his locator, the connection between them had grown much stronger. As a result, his perceptions and thoughts could now be clearly transmitted into the diary. The soul fragments no longer needed Saul to recreate things mentally. They could directly receive information from the outside. At the same time, messages from the diary's spiritual dimension could reach Saul much faster. Although they still appeared in the form of text, Saul could now absorb them at lightning speed. The words were like imprints on his very consciousness, no longer limited by his eyes or brain. This naturally made his response time to emergencies much quicker, and it made communication with the four soul fragments much smoother. In other words, the original trio, now four, had evolved from an encyclopedia into something closer to a smart voice assistant. They had far more autonomy now. Upon hearing Saul's words, the three remaining fragments were overjoyed. Though their time spent in the black pages of the diary wasn't uncomfortable, more like a deep sleep to conserve energy, that feeling of blinking and months have passed wasn't exactly pleasant. It felt like they'd been abandoned by the world. Now that they could observe the outside world again, they naturally gained a sense of freedom. All four respectfully bowed to Saul. Even the six-armed Angela, though still inexperienced, could read the room well enough. Afterward, Saul called Angela forward. Not knowing what would happen, she came with a bit of unease, but she didn't hesitate for a moment in obeying Saul's command. Staring at this girl, both familiar and unfamiliar, Saul thought to himself, This person still has Angela's habit of reading people's expressions, but she's more decisive and brave. If she had been the old Angela, she might never have made it this far. Though their faces were identical, he needed to draw a clear line between the two. Can your current appearance still be changed? Once decided, it can't be changed, the six-armed Angela replied, fluttering her large eyes. Do you not like this look? Her 6 hands began to nervously tangle together again, completely ruining the pitiful vibe she had been trying to project with her adorable face. Saul didn't feel disappointed. At the moment, his emotional state was still one of detachment. It's fine if you can't change, but you must clarify your own identity. If you keep seeing yourself as Angela, it might harm you as a newly formed complete soul. In severe cases, it could lead to contamination or even transformation. The girl paused, then tensed up. Though she'd fused 3 consciousnesses, her understanding of that fusion was still shallow. She hadn't realized that letting conflicting thoughts grow unchecked could bring about such serious consequences. I understand. Until I've redefined myself, I won't pursue the memories of those 3 past identities anymore. The 6-armed Angela quickly added, Please, Master, give me a new name. Chapter 286. What I want is not that. 6-armed Angela asked Saul to give her a new name, so she could use it as her new identity. But Saul, in his current state, wasn't interested in naming anyone. He rejected her flatly. Your identity is yours to define. The girl fell into hesitation again. No rush, Saul said, then turned his attention back to the other 3 soul consciousnesses. While he wasn't communicating with them, the energy depletion of their soul consciousnesses was very slow. Now that the diary is functioning as a locator, even the energy drain during communication has lessened. That means I won't need to replenish them as often. He didn't feel any joy, only calmly analyzed the current situation. After that, Saul told the 4 of them to wait off to the side. He once again began flipping through the diary. He had already reread everything in the diary and had a good understanding of the 4 souls' conditions. Now that the mental realm was still stable, Saul decided to use the History Watcher ability again to view the diary. He wanted to see, by getting even closer to the diary's consciousness, whether he could witness a different past. Don't disturb me, he instructed. The 4 soul consciousnesses quickly stepped back, respectfully acknowledging his request. Saul lowered his head and activated his mental power. He didn't need to focus it on his eyes. After all, right now he was just a consciousness himself. As Saul's awareness flowed, a star in the sky suddenly began to flicker. That star was far dimmer than the rest of the lights above. And after flashing rapidly for a moment, it grew even dimmer. Saul, fully focused on the diary, didn't notice it, but the other 4 souls did. Especially Agu and Morden, the 2 of them exchanged a glance. They observed the flickering star for several seconds, then turned their attention to the other stars, and their expressions gradually shifted from calm to solemn. Their master was using some kind of power, and his power was potent enough to rival the stars in the sky. For a moment, the 2 quick-witted minds fell completely silent. Only Angela, who was cautiously keeping her mind restrained, and Herman, who wasn't that sharp to begin with, remained relatively calm. Saul, unaware that Agu and Morden had just reevaluated his level due to their own overthinking, remained focused on digging through a new piece of history from the diary. As Saul channeled his mental power and looked once more into the dead wizard's diary, light and shadow shifted, and a new world unfolded before him. It was a quiet night, and Saul was observing the land from an aerial perspective. On the ground there was no grass or trees, only bones in endless heaps wherever the eye could see. In the distance were snow-capped mountains stretching far and wide, but none stood taller than the one before Saul. Yet this mountain wasn't made of snow, it was a mountain of corpses. This mountain, made of rotting flesh and white bones, rose into the clouds. The higher one looked, the fresher the corpses. It was an upside-down snow mountain, white at the bottom, red at the top. At the summit of the Bone Mountain sat a massive throne carved from gray stone. The throne was ancient and imposing, its back engraved with densely packed runes. It was, strangely enough, the most normal thing on the mountain. A blurry, shadowy figure sat squarely on the throne, holding in his hand none other than the diary Saul knew all too well. One hand held the diary, the other held a black fountain pen, scribbling furiously on its pages. But this time, due to the angle of the vision, Saul couldn't see what was being written. However, as the figure continued writing, the corpse mountain at his feet rose higher and higher, reaching closer and closer to the starry sky above. Saul didn't know how long it lasted, his perspective rising with the mountain. But the figure grew more and more agitated, his writing increasingly sloppy and erratic. Time passed. Eventually, the shadow stopped writing, dropped the pen, and looked up at the sky. The stars above were still impossibly distant. "This path leads nowhere," the man muttered softly. The sentence seemed like a variant of the language of the dead. Saul could barely understand it. Then the man gripped the diary's cover in one hand and tore out every single page with the other. He casually tossed the red hardcover down the corpse mountain. The dark red shell tumbled down along the flesh and bones, vanishing into the sea of blood, never to be found again. The torn pages, too, crumbled to dust, falling like snowflakes and settling upon the corpse mountain. As the blood-red, bone-white mountain was slowly blanketed and concealed by white flakes, until its original form was no longer visible, Saul heard the black figure sigh and vanish. That piece of history came to an end. Saul opened his eyes and returned once more to the mental realm. The four soul consciousnesses were still waiting nearby, watching him cautiously, unaware that Saul had just sat through a short movie in front of them. That was another slice of the diary's history. Is it trying to show me something? That shadow caused so much death, but clearly the deaths didn't give him the outcome he wanted. This path leads nowhere. What didn't death achieve? Godhood. That was the only possibility Saul could think of. After all, most wizards pursued knowledge ultimately in pursuit of power. And gods were the highest form of life, born from the collective consciousness of countless intelligent beings. In the wizarding world Saul resided in, the concept of gods existed too, but most were simply powerful beings who called themselves gods or were worshipped by the weak as one. Loosen the definition a bit, and even a creature like the nightmare butterfly could pass as a god to the ignorant. That shadow in history created death, and Kismet created death too. But Saul didn't think the shadow was Kismet. Though he couldn't see the face of the figure on the throne, his aura was completely different from Kismet. Did Kismet know that creating death wouldn't lead to success? And even if it could lead to godhood, Saul had no intention of following that path to power. For one reason, his worldview didn't align with it. In a world of mental power and conscious entities, doing things that clashed with one's worldview wasn't just a matter of inner unease. It would truly lead to corruption and contamination. Saul stared at the diary in his hand and asked silently, "Is death what you want?" The diary didn't answer. So he answered himself, "No." He smiled slightly. "What I want isn't that. No matter whether this path leads nowhere, I have my own way. What I seek is not death." Just as this thought passed through Saul's mind, the dead wizard's diary hovering above his right hand suddenly began to flip rapidly. After it passed through the golden pages, the white pages filled with unknown handwriting started to crumble one by one. Just like in the history he had seen, the white pages turned to powder and flew up into the pitch-black sky above, vanishing completely. The others looked up at the fragments disappearing into the heavens, their faces full of confusion. Only Saul remained calm, though a trace of melancholy stirred in his heart. He understood this meant he had likely lost whatever inheritance the diary's previous owner had left for him. But he felt no regret. That path was never mine. That's what he told himself. The four around him, though they didn't know what had happened, could sense something had changed in Saul, as though he had undergone a transformation. The locator function is already complete. Third rank is just a matter of spellcraft now. I've abandoned the path of my predecessor, though I still haven't clearly defined my own. But I'm just a prospective third-rank apprentice. There's no need to rush. Saul slowly gathered his thoughts. He could feel his History Watcher ability had grown incredibly weak, no longer usable on the diary. And his next target couldn't be too powerful, nor too complex. It had to be someone Saul was relatively familiar with. Saul raised an eyebrow. Little Algy, could that work? Chapter 287, Battlefield of the Mind. Saul finalized the last suitable candidate for History Watcher. But since little Algy couldn't enter his mental realm, there was no rush to carry out that step just yet. He closed the diary and walked toward the four dazed soul consciousness forms. As he moved, the platform beneath his feet began to shift its shape. The once gray, circular stone platform started transforming, its color, material, and structure all changing from before. Underfoot, it turned into light-colored marble tiles etched with intricate patterns. One section of the ground rose up, rapidly forming a black flat panel. One side of the panel was exceptionally smooth, clearly reflecting the images of the four soul consciousness forms. The four stared at the panel in front of them, unable to comprehend what it was. But Saul knew it was a screen he had manifested. In the next instant, two words appeared on the screen. Resurrection. At the same time, the clothing on Saul's body changed with a shimmer of light. When the glow faded, his apprentice robe had become a white lab coat. In his mind, that's what smart people always wore. He curled his index finger and tapped on the screen. Let's move on to something serious. My current focus is on dark element magic, particularly in the field of souls. It's foreseeable that resurrection will definitely become a major topic in the future. At the mention of resurrection, the four soul were overcome with complex and conflicting emotions. As without body soul consciousnesses, they were essentially the luckier kind of dead. And as undead, how could they not yearn for resurrection? But even simple death was a domain accessible only to fourth-rank wizards and above. And throughout the Western continent, not a single fourth-rank wizard existed. The most powerful one around was only third rank, and even he had no strong backing, only able to throw his weight around a bit in the Western continent. In front of someone like Gorsa, who had a powerful family behind him, he still had to tread carefully. Saul gave the four a few seconds to digest this before continuing. Of course, this topic might be one I can't complete even in my entire lifetime. So it's only our ultimate goal. We can't afford to neglect our other studies and development either. As Saul spoke, the words on the screen shifted. Soul attacks. He went on, soul attacks are the direction I plan to research next. It's currently my strongest method and the one I've studied most thoroughly. Next, a large curly bracket appeared beneath the phrase, soul attacks. Inside the upper half of the bracket, two words emerged. External. For now, I've got two initial ideas for offensive approaches. The first is external. Saul stretched out both hands. Before their eyes, his hands gradually turned transparent, then elongated and transformed, from human hands into octopus-like tentacles. External means transforming my extendable soul form into a weapon, attacking the enemy's soul directly. Then the screen displayed the words. Internal. Saul stared at those words for a moment before continuing. Internal might not be the most accurate term. What I mean is pulling the enemy's soul into here. What? Agu and Morden exclaimed almost in unison. Angela, still unnamed at the time, and Herman, who didn't know much about soul matters, just looked on blankly. I've actually done something like this before, Saul said, looking at Morden. It was after I established this mental realm that I was able to defeat Mr. Morden, who had already turned into a wraith. So when I'm facing enemies who are stronger overall but weaker in mental or soul strength, can't I just drag them in here and beat them senseless? Morden spoke first. He didn't mind Saul having once defeated his chaotic self. If the master can achieve this, then even a first-rank wizard would stand no chance once inside, and even a second-rank wizard with weaker soul strength might lose to you. At the time, though Morden had been a second-rank true wizard, he had been dead for years and had become a fragmented wraith. He no longer truly counted as second rank. Once Morden gave his approval, Agu stepped in to advise caution. But Master, no one ever done anything like this before. Pulling someone else's soul consciousness into your own mental world is extremely dangerous. He continued, seemingly worried Saul might rush into it. A person's mindscape is actually quite fragile. Only soul specialist wizards prepared for mutual destruction would ever draw others into their mental world for a final showdown. At this point, Agu suddenly realized that Saul's mental realm wasn't so simple. Never mind the mysterious, unsettling starry sky overhead, or the ever-shifting platform underfoot. Forget the miraculous diary in Saul's hand that could forcibly dispel corruption and restore clarity to soul fragments. Even just Saul's ability to freely reshape his mental form, that alone was something many true wizards couldn't do. With this in mind, Agu changed his tone. Of course, Master is not an ordinary wizard. That diary alone has the power to forcibly extract another's consciousness. He sighed inwardly. Still, for safety's sake, unless absolutely necessary, don't pull in a second-rank wizard. At that level, their self-awareness is extremely solid. Plus, they usually come prepared with protective measures specifically against soul-based attacks. Saul nodded. What Agu said made sense. Both Agu and Morden had once been second-rank true wizards. Their experience and insight were valuable. Still, Saul wasn't discouraged. His mental realm had the diary as an anchor. It was extremely stable, and the diary's capabilities weren't limited to just second-rank opponents. But there was no need to explain all that to them. I understand. For now, using the mental realm as a battlefield is just a theoretical concept. We haven't even solved the basic problems yet. Whatever difficulties arise in the future, we'll tackle them one at a time. Hearing this, the others understood. Saul had firmly decided to turn his mental realm into a battlefield of the mind. Seeing their tense expressions, Saul said flatly, "Let's start by working on the first step, external attacks on other people's soul consciousness. I plan to combine my soul tentacles." He wiggled his octopus-like tendrils to demonstrate, "with the second-tier spell I've been studying, Touch of Torment. Do any of you have relevant experience or advice?" After speaking, Saul's two tentacles wrapped around each other. Other people crossed their arms once or twice. He did it a dozen times over. As usual, Agu spoke first. Having once served as the Wizard Tower's librarian, he had considerable theoretical knowledge. Touch of Torment is also a dark element spell, but it mainly inflicts damage on the physical body. If Master wishes to incorporate the soul tentacles, the damage could be split between body and soul. But first, we'll need to address the conflicting nature of the two spells. Before he could finish, the ground beneath them suddenly trembled. He quickly fell silent, turning in surprise to Saul, who was also looking around in confusion. "Is time up?" Agu asked cautiously. Maybe Saul had been the first to sense the instability in the space. He had spent a long time on the mental realm this time, far longer than last time. A satisfactory result. Still, having to end the brainstorming session halfway was a bit of a disappointment. Agu, Morden, Herman, and then Saul paused. The girl with Angela's face, the newly formed fusion soul, still hadn't given herself a name. The other three, upon hearing their names, all turned back into black pages and returned to the diary. Only the girl remained standing in place. Suddenly, she smiled. I've been thinking all this time about what name to give myself. But when Master called me just now, I realized, no matter what I'm called, I'm still me. My essence doesn't change. She traced her finger along her lips thoughtfully. Since that's what you called me, maybe it's fate. I'll go by in from now on. She walked up to Saul, leaning slightly forward with a tilt of her chin and a pout, her big round eyes sparkling. Thank you for naming me, Master Tilda. Chapter 288, The Visitor. The young girl, whose average age was probably in the hundreds, was currently using her charm aptitude on her master. Unfortunately, Saul's emotions hadn't yet returned to normal. He simply stared at Anne's adorable face, his voice icy as he spat out two words. Go back. The six-armed girl, now renamed Anne, shrank her neck and instantly turned into a streak of black light, vanishing into the diary. In the next moment, the round platform began shaking more violently. The black display screen fell to the floor with a bang but, surprisingly, didn't shatter. The white lab coat on Saul's body slid off like flowing water, transforming once more into the black apprentice robe. His octopus-like tentacles tightened and retracted, reverting to long human arms. Saul closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he was back in the Black Castle's laboratory. As he awoke, the effects of the grinding sound fruit potion began to wear off rapidly. Emotions gushed out like water from a newly tapped spring, bubbling up uncontrollably. And yet the world in Saul's eyes was still swaying. Only after steadying his mind did he realize he was being shaken by little Algie. So it wasn't that his time had run out, but that someone had forcibly pulled his plug. What is it, little Algie? Saul wasn't angry. He knew the little plant must have noticed something. As soon as it realized Saul had awakened, little Algie moved aside. A new dark green vine extended from the ventilation shaft above, unfurling slender, hand-like leaves in front of him. Saul placed his hand upon the leafy palm and activated his mental power. In an instant, he entered the world of the Black Castle's vines and received their sensory information. A carriage had entered the Black Castle forest. It had already passed through the mushroom path and was just about to reach the gates of the castle. Someone's coming, Saul withdrew his hand. Got it. Vine, stay alert. Notify me immediately if anyone else approaches in secret. The dark green branch twitched in acknowledgement. The Devil Vine was the massive plant rooted beneath the Black Castle. Its tendrils spread throughout the forest, and when fully active, it could monitor all movement across the entire area. Since becoming the castle's temporary master, Saul had kept the Devil Vine at full operation. After all, compared to the previous veteran third-rank apprentices, his means of self-defense were still lacking. Now that it was confirmed someone was coming by carriage, it likely wasn't with ill intent. It's only been 3 days since I became the Black Castle's temporary master. The Wizard Tower probably hasn't received word yet, so the visitor must be from Borderfall City, which is only half a day away. They probably already know about Machi Machi's death. Are they just here to say hello, or do they have business? Saul mentally reviewed the sensations relayed by the Devil Vine. The wheel tracks are heavy, looks like they're carrying supplies. Could it be a delivery? Stepping out of the magic circle, Saul accepted the cloak little Algie offered, which had been casually draped over a chair earlier. He caught it with one hand and gave it a slight shake, letting it fall over his body from head to toe. Then he strode out of the lab and descended the stairs. As he moved, countless black vines sprouted instantly from the walls. Thick as pythons and devoid of leaves, they slithered along the stone like slick serpents, overlapping and intertwining with the sound of skin rubbing against skin. They followed closely behind Saul, giant black tentacles that accompanied him to the entrance of the Black Castle. The next moment, Saul reached out and opened the door, just as a familiar figure stepped up the last step. Wizard Apprentice Barry. Saul narrowed his eyes slightly. It's only been a few days, but your presence is even more imposing now, Lord Saul, Barry said, a bright smile quickly appearing on his face. Greetings, what brings you to the Black Castle? Barry casually stepped aside and gestured toward the carriage behind him. It's nearly time for the castle's scheduled supply delivery. I assumed you've taken over as the temporary master, but just in case you had any additional needs, I thought I'd stop by and lend a hand. Saul glanced at the carriage. There was a faint magical ripple, but nothing strong. He couldn't sense any other presence either. Come in. I'm still getting familiar with this place, but another apprentice will likely replace me soon. When that happens, you might need to send someone from your side again. Of course, no problem at all. Barry entered with a smile. Shall I help you carry the goods inside? Saul gave a sideways glance. No need, I've got plenty of labor. The two walked down a narrow corridor until they reached a slightly more spacious hall. It had been lavishly decorated by Machi Machi, perfect for entertaining these court-trained apprentices. While they entered the castle, deep green vines emerged from the ground and slithered into the carriage. With its magical defenses already withdrawn, the vines faced no resistance as they coiled around a large crate of neatly sealed supplies and ferried it through the castle's rear entrance. While the devil vine dutifully played the porter, Apprentice Barry had already settled into a plush, comfortable couch, praising Saul's aesthetic sense. These vines on the wall, did you plant them? They look even more grand than the original devil vine. He praised aloud, but inside Barry was cringing. These dark element wizard apprentices had the strangest taste. Who in their right mind would plant unsightly climbing vines all over their walls? Especially these black, leafless things that twitched now and then, more like a nest of black pythons tangled together. It made Barry's skin crawl, though he maintained a polite smile. Saul, unaware that little algae was triggering Barry's trypophobia, continued chatting calmly, secretly clasping his hands tightly together beneath his robe. The force he used made the bones in his fingers creak and groan. Barry paused mid-sentence and looked around. What's that noise? Saul's hands ached, but his expression remained unchanged. Probably the vines. They're a bit more active than the devil vine. As he finished speaking, the vines on the wall squirmed even more enthusiastically. Barry's mouth twitched. In the end, he couldn't bring himself to give another forced compliment. Don't mind me, please continue. Then I'll go on about the situation in Grind Sale Town, Barry said, trying his best to ignore the writhing walls. The corruption has been completely cleared, but that land won't be habitable for at least 10 years. 10 years isn't that long. True, but if people settle there afterward, there's a high chance of deformed offspring. Not sure if the Wizard Tower would be interested. If not, the Duchy is willing to offer 500 living test subjects to purchase the area outright. Saul didn't respond. That's something the next master of the castle can decide. Barry froze briefly, realizing Saul wasn't interested. Yes, of course, he said, quickly dropping the topic. The old man you asked me to look after has already settled in a village near Borderfall City. I bought 100 acres of land and hired 20 servants to care for him. I also gave the local nobles a heads up. Don't worry, his remaining years will be worry-free. Saul only gave a light nod, asking no more. Underneath his robe, his clasped hands tensed once more. Seeing that Saul didn't seem interested in continuing the conversation, Barry understood he wasn't exactly welcome. Since the main points had been covered, he stood to leave. Then I won't disturb your research any longer. I hope your stay at the Black Castle is pleasant. If you ever come to Borderfall City, you're always welcome at the City Lord's estate. Saul rose with him, merely nodding in response to the small talk. He escorted Barry to the foyer, watching as the man boarded the now empty carriage and disappeared into the dark woods. The moment the carriage vanished from sight, the heavy front door slammed shut, snapped closed by a black tendril. And in the very next second, Saul collapsed to the ground. Clutching his chest, he curled into a ball. Little Algie rushed out, helpless and confused. Saul struggled to lift his head, his eyes bloodshot. Through clenched teeth, he growled, "Damn it, the grinding sound fruit extract has major side effects. My emotions are completely unstable right now. Just thinking about all those diary pages I gave up and destroyed makes me want to cry." Chapter 289, Trouble. After consuming the grinding sound fruit extract, all of Saul's emotions had been compressed to their absolute limit. But once the effects of the potion began to wear off, those compressed emotions lashed back with overwhelming intensity. Details he hadn't paid attention to at the time, and feelings that hadn't even arisen before, all launched a fierce counterattack against him. The thought of having given up on the previous user's diary experience, not something he truly regretted, now pained him more than it should have. Under the side effects of the grinding sound fruit, that mild ache twisted into an agony that felt like a drill boring into his heart. He hated it so much, he nearly collapsed to the ground and started punching the floor with his fists. Other events also triggered intense emotional reactions, but none as violently as this one. It had gotten so bad that just moments ago, he had nearly lost control in front of Barry. Thankfully, he managed to hold out until after seeing the man off. Otherwise, the embarrassment would have been monumental. The side effects of the grinding sound fruit are this intense. Saul couldn't help but wonder if Senior Nick experienced the same when he used it in the past. He suddenly remembered how strange and twisted Nick had looked before Saul left, something about his half-human, half-ghoul appearance, and concern began to rise for the man's well-being. Maybe it was due to Saul's powerful mental strength that the side effects hit fast, but also faded quickly. Within a minute, the emotional feedback began to dissipate. 3 minutes later, he was already back on his feet, looking as if nothing had happened. Good thing no one else was around. The side effects are brief, but still a huge hassle. If I'd had a sudden breach in my mental defenses back there, it could have triggered a total breakdown. I really need to find better materials to build a more stable mental realm. Even though Saul now used the diary as his locator, that didn't mean he no longer needed a mental realm. Especially considering his second internal theory, pulling a person's soul consciousness into the platform for battle, a dangerous and insane idea. What set Saul apart from others, though, was the diary. It allowed him to foresee danger and screen whether an enemy could safely be dragged into that battlefield. But regardless of the safeguard, the prerequisite for such a maneuver was a mental battlefield strong enough to contain it. After straightening his robes, Saul turned to inspect the supplies that Barry had brought in. He might only be the temporary master of Black Castle, but he still needed to ensure a proper handover. The supplies sent from Borderfall City weren't plentiful, but for Black Castle, which usually housed just one person, they were more than enough. The boxes mostly contained survival rations, like dried meat and dense bread. Apparently, the previous master of Black Castle had no interest in the pleasures of food. "This is a little too basic. Crates and crates of bread and dried meat. not even a single vegetable. Did the former masters just make their own nutrient paste? The food and daily necessities were neatly packed into small boxes, which were then loaded into a giant wooden crate. Numerous magic formation were carved onto the outside, all designed to preserve freshness. At each of the four corners of the crate, there were embedded magic crystals powering the formation. Using a magic formation to preserve food was a pretty extravagant choice. In the Kema Duchy, only the royal family or a handful of powerful families could afford something like this. Saul extended his mental probe. He could detect faint traces of magical energy, but nothing that exceeded what was expected from a preservation formation. Should be fine. He clapped the dust off his hands, ready to leave. There was no way he could open and inspect every box. This level of checking was already thorough enough. If something buried deeper inside turned out to be of poor quality, then it would be the responsibility of Black Castle's next master to take it up with Borderfall City. Besides, even if there were quality issues, the worst that would happen is that they'd send another box of food. Saul still had his own food stores, so he didn't plan on touching this crate. He would leave it untouched for the next owner. But just as he turned to go, he paused and looked back at the crate, eyes narrowing as he scanned it again. He'd already developed a habit of using semi-immersive meditation to examine every place he visited, so he applied the same technique to this crate. A quick sweep revealed no abnormalities, but Saul wasn't in a rush. His eyes kept drifting across every side of the crate. Mutations and contamination often hid in the tiniest of details. In places like Grind Sale Town, the overall environment was too massive for such meticulous inspection, but for a single crate, Saul didn't mind wasting a minute. Then, as he crouched to check the underside of the crate, he spotted it, slowly squeezing out from a bottom corner, a pale gray dome. It resembled a rounded bun. Saul's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't stop scanning. He continued inspecting the other three sides. However, he kept the dome-shaped object in his peripheral vision. As he shifted his stance, the dome slowly withdrew into the crate. Saul inspected all six sides thoroughly. Then he brushed off the dust from his hands and walked out of the storage room. As soon as he shut the door behind him, his expression turned grim. There's something inside that crate. Saul strode quickly toward the lab. Did Barry put it there? Or did someone tamper with the supplies sent to the Wizard Tower? Using the crate's preservation formation to mask faint magical energy was clever. If Saul hadn't developed the habit of seeing through materials for contamination, he probably wouldn't have noticed anything wrong with the supplies. He hadn't been particularly suspicious of Barry's visit. After all, the corruption in Grind Sale Town should have already been resolved, and Barry's reasons for visiting, to check on Saul and deliver news about the mad old man, had seemed plausible enough. But now, thinking it over, it was either Barry had been used by someone else, or someone had exploited Saul's recent takeover of Black Castle, assuming he might be careless about inspecting the supplies. No one would sneak something like that in without a reason. Saul reached the lab and quickly cleared the table, erasing any traces of magic formation from the floor. Then he summoned Little Alga, instructing it to alert the Devil's Vine. Both demonic creatures were to increase security. Is this an attack specifically targeting me, or a general assault on Black Castle? Saul hadn't yet mastered a second-tier spell. If this was some hidden operation from Kema Duchy, where Barry hailed from, he really might not be able to resist alone. How did Machi Machi usually receive messages from the Wizard Tower? If I knew the method, I could report this to the tower and ask how they'd handle it. Unfortunately, Saul hadn't inherited the castle through normal procedures. Many rooms and tools still weren't accessible to him, especially the ones sealed with magic locks by Machi Machi. If he didn't handle them properly, Forcing them open could destroy whatever was inside or even backfire and harm Saul himself. It's a pity Lady Ura only had time to hand over control of the Devil's Vine before she left. If only she had. Wait. Saul froze in the middle of packing up. Could it be? Ura deliberately acted in a rush, so she wouldn't have to tell me how to contact the Wizard Tower. Chapter 290, Infiltration. Saul wasn't sure if his guess was right. By all accounts, the Kemaduchi and the Wizard Tower were allies. They shouldn't be scheming against him. But alliances could sometimes be more complicated than anyone could imagine. He packed away his most important items, though he didn't bother to thoroughly clean the laboratory. Instead, he deliberately left behind signs of use, then quietly sat down at the experiment table, as if still engrossed in studying magic. Just before sitting down, he casually brushed a hand against the wall, leaving behind a small, nearly invisible crack. From daylight to deep night. Unlike the Wizard Tower, Black Castle didn't keep its lights burning round the clock. Whether out of thrift or simply for convenience, few lamps were set up here at all. So when night came, Black Castle lived up to its name, shrouded in pitch blackness. Moonlit shadows flitted across the treetops, casting eerie silhouettes that made any peasants glancing upward doubt their own eyes. In the pitch-dark storage room, something emerged from the bottom of a giant, not yet fully dismantled wooden crate, a pale grayish-white hemisphere. The sturdy wooden casing posed no obstacle. The sphere slowly elongated, revealing a pair of eyes. It wasn't a sphere, it was a bald human head. Its pupils were tiny, and the whites of its eyes took up almost the entire eyeball, nearly the same color as its skin. At a glance, it looked like the only parts of its eyeballs were the small, black bean-sized pupils. The head slithered out through a gap beneath the crate, nose, mouth, chin, and then its long neck. An endlessly long neck. No body. The tiny pupils flicked left and right, surveying the room in the darkness. Then it locked onto the door. The neck continued stretching, pushing the bald head toward the storage room's exit. Though the gap beneath the door was narrow, it couldn't stop the head from slipping through. It exited easily and looked both ways. The storage room was located at the end of the first floor of Black Castle, and beyond it stretched a winding corridor. The head glanced around, then opened its mouth wide. From the gap between its toothless lips slithered a thin, pale tongue, matching the skin tone, topped with a small, round bulb. Once the tongue left the mouth, it began to swell, especially the bulbous tip, growing to nearly the size of a head. That tip split open along two seams, revealing a pair of tiny pupils. Then a third seam opened beneath the eyes, forming a gaping mouth. And from that mouth, another thin tongue emerged, also ending in a rounded tip. This, too, sprouted eyes and a mouth. Then came a second tongue from the original head. Then a third, a fourth. Each tongue grew a head with eyes and mouth, and then birthed another tongue from within. An uncountable number of identical heads began stretching out and slithering down the corridor. They moved across the floor, up the walls, endlessly lengthening. Their tiny black pupils trembled with excitement, yet not a single sound was made. Soon the heads carpeted the entire hallway and slithered toward the first-floor foyer. No guests were visiting tonight, so the front hall was just as dim. The grand chandeliers and ornate wallpaper seemed to shift into something else entirely under the pale moonlight. The first head reached the foyer and continued exploring, until it suddenly stopped. Its quivering pupil shifted to the corner of its eye and spotted a black vine coiling tightly around it. Devil Vine. The mouth finally spoke its first words. But it didn't resist. It simply extended another tongue, birthing the next head. One by one, each head caught by the devil vine didn't resist. They let themselves be bound, but not before producing another tongue, which continued the search through Black Castle. Sensing no resistance, the devil vine perhaps mistook them for ordinary snakes, bugs, or rodents sneaking in from the forest, and didn't issue an alert to its temporary master. Meanwhile, on the third floor in his laboratory, Saul was writing furiously. Suddenly, his hand paused mid-sentence, an unidentified intruder and yet no alarm. He turned his head slightly and muttered, "They came prepared. They managed to disable Black Castle's most sensitive detection method in one move. Then it's entirely possible the rest of the defenses won't hold up either." Had it not been for Saul's control of the devil vine, far exceeding that of a mere temporary master, he might not have noticed anything until they were already upon him. But now, if I charge out, can I take down whoever's lurking in the shadows? A familiar sensation rose in his mind. The diary slowly unfolded. 5th September, year 316 of the lunar calendar. A troublesome guest knocks at your door. The enthusiastic host wishes to make him stay forever. The guest brings a bouquet. The host prepares fresh seafood. After a back-and-forth exchange, you invite the guest to stay forever. But alas, you miss the chance to meet the second guest. Reading the entry, Saul paused. He had deliberately guided the diary with a clear strategy, seeking to confirm whether he'd face a life-threatening danger. The moment the diary appeared, he feared the worst, that he was no match for the intruder and would die tonight. But seeing the entry wasn't a death forecast surprised him. After all, he'd always assumed that anyone resorting to sneak attacks wouldn't be a true wizard, and that any regular third-rank apprentice was no longer a threat to him. What surprised him even more was the implication of the diary. According to it, he would defeat the first enemy, but this also meant the diary's warnings were no longer limited to death alone. He would merely subdue the first guest and scare off the second, missing the chance to meet them. The diary's warnings have upgraded. It won't only alert me to death threats anymore. To test his theory, Saul immediately switched mental strategies. What if I hide instead? The diary reappeared, offering several more lines. Again, not a death warning. Just as I thought, Saul smiled faintly. This is the diary's first alert since it evolved into a locator. That's why I've only just realized the trigger conditions have changed. As his connection with the diary deepened, it began offering more comprehensive feedback. If it's following its usual narrative logic, then missing the second guest could lead to future consequences. I'll have to find a way to flush them out. Knock, knock, knock. Suddenly, someone knocked on the lab's door. Saul glanced toward it. Through the gap beneath the door, something shadowy seemed to shift and tremble. A guest uninvited, arriving at last. He smiled softly, ignored the midnight knocking, turned his head, and pulled his hood over his head with his left hand, continuing to write. Scratch, scratch. Scratch. The room was silent, save for the soft rasp of pen against parchment. Outside the door, the guest gently tapped his forehead against the wood. Every 3 knocks, he would pause, grin, and wait patiently for the host to open up. All around the doorway, on the floor, walls, and ceiling, dozens of identical heads crowded the entrance, their wide black and white eyes pressed to every gap. Jostling and nudging, they fought for space at the crack in the door, pupils quivering with excitement as they peeked inside, catching a glimpse of a cloaked figure seated with his back to them. Their eyes trembled, thrilled with anticipation, waiting for the host to open the door. Chapter 291, Counter-Tracking. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. The door, surrounded by dozens of long-necked human heads, remained tightly shut. The excitement in the eyes of the waiting visitors outside was slowly fading. They shook their heads, expressions gradually turning savage. In the darkness of the hallway, A rustling sound echoed. More and more heads were hurrying over from afar, eager to get a piece of the action. If someone were to step into the Black Castle at this moment, they would see countless human heads entangled by dark green vines on the walls, each with a long neck extending from their mouths. The walls of the castle were now completely overtaken by alternating shades of gray and dark green, the original appearance no longer discernible. If this someone continued walking inward, they would discover that all those heads were ultimately extending toward the same destination, the laboratory on the third floor. At this moment, nearly 100 heads had gathered outside the lab's door. They were crammed together, face pressed against face, necks twisted around necks. Their noses were squished against the door, visibly deformed. Having run out of room to knock with their heads, the visiting heads now opened their mouths one by one and stuck out new, round-tipped tongues to knock on the door instead. Tab, tab, tab. Tab, tab, tab. Tab, 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 tab. The sound grew sharp and rapid. After another minute, the door was riddled with dents. Then suddenly, as if receiving a command, the heads all ceased their actions at once. They looked at each other, then slowly backed away. About a meter. Then they surged forward again with a crash. Bang! With a massive impact, the heavily damaged door shattered, and countless heads, mixed with splinters of the wooden door, poured into the brightly lit room. However, the figure inside the room still had their back to the sea of faces. The cloak on his body trembled faintly, as if he was still writing furiously. The long-suppressed heads let out strange chuckles and swarmed forward. They would show this rude host the cost of ignoring his guests. The hairless head smashed toward the figure sitting firmly in the chair, but the moment they touched it, the figure vanished into thin air. Dozens of faces slammed into the long desk. The books, ink, and even the desk itself were instantly smashed to pieces under the tremendous force. It was a vivid demonstration of the sheer destructive power these heads brought with their impact. But as the shards hit the floor, none of the heads felt that satisfying, elastic resistance of colliding with flesh. All that remained before them was a tattered cloak, scattered among the broken pieces of the desk. The person beneath the cloak had vanished in an instant. The heads backed off half a meter, confused. One of them, looking particularly distressed, crept closer to the debris and examined it carefully. But his brain wasn't quite up to processing what had just happened, so he simply gave up with a helpless sigh. Find him. Just then, a signal came from outside the Black Castle. The confusion vanished from the faces of the heads. They lit up with excitement once again, their mouths opening and closing incessantly, as if chanting, "Hide and seek, so much fun." One by one, they filed out of the laboratory and began combing the castle. Soon, the ransacked lab returned to stillness. Only the wreckage remained to tell the tale of its tragic fate. Meanwhile, hidden inside a seam in the wall, Saul had one eye pressed to the gap, calmly watching the entire process, from the moment the heads broke into the lab to the moment they destroyed the decoy cloak he had left behind. That's right, Saul hadn't been under the cloak at all. He had used magic trick, a simple yet practical zero-tear spell, to fix the cloak in place and make it twitch occasionally for realism. The moment he had thrown the cloak over himself, he had already slipped into the seam in the wall that he had prepared in advance. Thanks to this, he saw everything: the grotesque head smashing in, and a vague black figure flitting in through the window, the very presence that had reawakened the head's activity. As soon as the heads had left the room, Saul leapt out of the seam. His right eye bore a deep indentation from the prolonged pressure, something that even a zero-rank heal light wound spell couldn't remove. That mark would be with him for the rest of the day. Stepping out from the cramped space, Saul casually sealed up the gap, then pushed open the window with one hand and leapt out. Little Algie swiftly shot out, splitting in two, one end anchoring to the window, the other propelling Saul forward and clearing his path. Suspended midair by little Algy, Saul chased after the vague black silhouette, still having enough mental energy to grumble. Once I study second rank spell Touch of Torment and advance to rank 3, I really need to put flight on my to-learn list. He excelled at using the coordinate method to decipher runes. While this method became less effective with higher-level runes, it still allowed him to grasp more spell matrices than most during the early stages. As he mulled over these thoughts, Saul realized he had already lost track of the Shadow's trail, but he wasn't flustered. He landed lightly on the ground and spread his mental power outward. Instantly, countless tendrils burst from the soil, writhing toward him. These were the roots of the Devil Vine, buried deep underground for many years. They might not cover the entire Black Castle forest, but they span most of it. Those heads inside the castle are still looking for me. Tell those vines to cut the act. It's time to fight back. They can't even tell an intruder is at their doorstep when it's obvious at a glance that something is wrong. A portion of the tendrils receded into the soil. Saul then transmitted his mental power to another portion. Just now, someone unfamiliar released a burst of magic outside the castle. They can't have gone far. Activate all root systems in the forest, find this person, but don't alert the person. Another batch of tendrils slipped back underground. The Devil Vine's roots couldn't understand human speech, of course, but Saul had once completely infiltrated the vine's main spiritual core, giving him unprecedented control over it. He could command its roots to perform basic tasks. Besides, fighting and scouting were the very reasons this Devil Vine had been planted here in the first place. One could even say the Devil Vine was Machi Machi's true trump card in holding the Black Castle alone. But now it had no choice but to obey Saul. Even if the Black Castle were to welcome a new master in the future, they might not be able to completely seize control of the Devil Vine. After all, little Algy had somehow slipped into the Devil Vine's core, acting like a thug, extorting, pillaging, and feeding off it to grow stronger. If Saul hadn't stepped in to make it leave a little behind, it probably would have refused to come out at all. Just then, a thin tendril emerged from the earth again, pointing neatly in a single direction. Saul stopped in his tracks. Little Algy silently hoisted him into the air. "Let's give our guest a proper welcome," he said, letting his hands drop and slowly morph, becoming translucent, like the tentacles of an octopus dangling in the air. Chapter 292, Baiting Out Your Defense. Cadiz was hiding inside the hollow trunk of a towering tree in the Black Castle forest. He hadn't been a third-rank apprentice for long, but he was eager to prove himself. Lately, their land drifters had been having a streak of bad luck. In just a few months, they'd lost 2 third-rank apprentices and several second-rank apprentices. Losing second-rank apprentices wasn't too big a deal. The captain had a method of mass-producing them, just pile up lives, and in a year or two, the losses could be replenished. But third-rank apprentices weren't that easy to come by, especially since second-rank apprentices produced that way had an even lower success rate for advancing. That made third-rank apprentices highly valued among the land drifters. Because of that, each third-rank apprentice held considerable authority, but only the best among them were given special training by the captain and had the chance to become a frigate captain. When Cadiz was promoted to third rank, all the frigate captain spots had already been filled. On top of that, he wasn't particularly outstanding, so he'd never managed to snatch that lucrative post. Now, with the 2 third-rank apprentices who'd been blocking his path both dead by accident, this was his chance to stand out and receive the captain's favor. Whether he could rise above the others depended on whether he could drive the temporary master of the Black Castle into his trap tonight. What Cadiz didn't understand was, why had the captain gone so far, using these kinds of tactics just to deal with a second-rank apprentice. He looked down at the seed in his palm, unease rising in his heart. Holding this soul-devouring flower seed feels off. I hope I can catch that second-rank apprentice soon. Better get this hot potato off my hands as quickly as possible. Their land drifters were known for 3 unique products: the slender wraith, the thousand-eyed banshee, and the last, soul-devouring flowers. But most people had no idea what those 3 were actually used for. Caddes himself had only recently learned the purposes of the first 2. As for the soul-devouring flower seed he now held, he still had no clue what it did. Still, once he became a third-rank apprentice like Herman once was, able to independently command a frigate, he definitely earned the right to learn its secrets. Just then, noise stirred from inside the Black Castle. It seemed that, following his orders, the slender wraith had made an even bigger commotion, enough to rouse the devil vines. Caddes frowned. He wasn't afraid of disturbing the devil vines. With help from a certain mysterious ally arranged by the Mentor, as long as he withdrew before dawn, it wouldn't alarm the people down in Borderfall City. Still haven't found him. As time passed, the confidence Caddes had felt at the start began to fray. Mentor said if I don't complete this mission, the chance to be promoted to frigate captain is gone for good. He wavered. Should I go take a look? But I've already laid the trap in the forest, if I just leave. The crescent moon hung low. Caddes lingered in place, packing back and forth. No, something's clearly gone wrong with the slender wraith. If I stay here, this mission is going to fail. That second-rank apprentice is tougher than I expected, to stay hidden this long even with the wraith searching. Caddes decided to go personally. Whatever it took, he had to flush the enemy out. He slowly raised a hand, and the tree trunk in front of him split open. Caddes leapt out, but the moment his feet were about to touch the ground, something suddenly coiled around his waist. A chilling aura swept straight for his head. An ambush. He'd seen battle before and reacted instantly. Without looking back, Caddes raised his hand. A silver round shield materialized above his head. First-rank spell, Magic Shield. Though it didn't cover as much area as soul armor, its defensive strength was notably higher. The enemy had waited for the perfect moment to strike. It would be a powerful blow. Caddes had no idea who the attacker was or how strong they were. He could only counter with one of his strongest defenses. Clang! A crisp sound rang out. The attack was blocked. Caddes frowned. Something was off. The attack wasn't strong at all. So they just wanted to bait out one of my defenses. The thing wrapped around his waist suddenly tightened, yanking him upward. The chilling aura swept toward his legs this time. Not a vital point, but the power behind it was clearly greater. The attacker was trying to cripple his legs and prevent him from escaping. Caught off guard, Caddes was now at a disadvantage, each move restricted. If he wanted to turn things around, he had to launch a major counterattack. Otherwise, this would end in total defeat. Then, as he hung midair, Caddes twisted his waist with force and flipped his body over, now facing the sky. At the same time, a layer of fine yellow grease instantly spread across his skin, like cheese seeping through gauze. 2 black tentacles lashed down onto his legs the next moment, but the impact was dull, and they caused no real harm. The moment the tentacles touched the greasy layer, they froze. But then it shattered into pieces, revealing undamaged skin beneath. His pants were torn in 2 places, but his legs were completely unscathed. At that moment, having taken 3 blows, Caddes grinned menacingly. He'd endured that ambush not just to buy time to flip around and locate the attacker, but also to prepare his next strike. His hands, still coated with yellow grease, snapped forward the moment he spotted a black figure among the leaves. His lips moved rapidly. And then whoosh, the grease on his palms shot out like bullets. The figure didn't stop attacking either. Though the earlier blows hadn't landed cleanly, those black tentacles whipped down again toward the yellow bullets. But the moment Grease met the tentacle, the bullets pierced through them with ease, continuing their deadly path toward the figure in black. A faint aura shimmered around the figure, a soul armor spell. A gleam flashed through Caddy's eyes. If the enemy dared to rely on soul armor to tank the hit instead of dodging, then this would get interesting. This yellow grease wasn't just any ordinary spell. It was something Caddy's had crafted himself, combining a targeting spell with a rare material. It had both offensive and defensive capabilities. Without this unique spell, he might never have become a third-rank apprentice. But to Caddy's disappointment, the figure didn't recklessly take the hit. Instead, with impressive caution, he dodged every single grease bullet, not even letting one brush his clothes. As the enemy moved, he emerged from the shadows. Moonlight spilled across his face, revealing a calm, expressionless, boyish face. Caddy's narrowed his eyes. He hadn't expected the very person he'd been searching for to be right in front of him. Well, that saves me some effort. Though the plan hadn't gone quite as expected, Saul had finally left the Black Castle. That's right, the one who had ambushed Caddy's from the treetop shadows was Saul. The moment Saul saw the change in Caddy's gaze, he knew it. This man had been after him all along. Chapter 293, Confirmatory Offensive Test. Saul leapt out from between the trees, landing steadily with little Algie's help, and at the same time flung two black tentacles at Caddy's once more. The latter responded with the same high-penetration yellow bullets, then advanced instead of retreating, looking like he intended to engage Saul in close combat. But simultaneously, the grease-like substance on one of his palms receded, revealing a seed gripped tightly in his hand. Saul froze at the sight of the seed. Then, to Caddy's surprise, he turned and bolted, flinging two more black tentacles backward to cover his retreat. Caddy's was momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected Saul to be wary of the seed in his palm. Did he recognize it? That's impossible. The soul-devouring flower seed was one of the top-level secrets of the land drifters. Had Caddy's not been entrusted with this mission, he wouldn't have been qualified to know what it looked like, let alone its function. He must just be overly cautious. No matter, now that he's seen the seed, he's not getting away. No matter how unusual your methods, before the soul-devouring flower, the schemes of a mere apprentice are useless. Caddy's let out a vicious grin and crushed the seed in his palm. With his other hand, he once again fired yellow bullets, which quickly shattered the oncoming black tentacles. A pale green sprout emerged from Caddy's palm, while a yellowish-brown root dug into his flesh. Just as Caddy's was preparing to witness the soul-devouring flower's power, something caught his eye, something gray and shapeless emerging from the shattered black tentacle. Confident that he had dealt with Saul's final gambit, Caddy's had continued charging forward. Only now did he notice the semi-transparent shadow hanging in the air, and it was too late to stop. Gritting his teeth, he shot out another yellow bullet with one hand, while raising the sprout in his other hand as a shield. There was no way Saul's concealed trick could withstand both physical and soul attacks at the same time. But in the next second, Caddy's eyes widened in disbelief. The gray-white shadow emerging from the broken tentacle completely ignored the yellow bullets, letting it pass through its non-corporeal form as it pressed forward toward him. Caddy's had no choice but to raise his right hand to meet it. He recognized Saul's attack as a soul strike, but how could a Quays, third-rank apprentice's soul attack ever pose a threat to the land drifter's treasure? Then, unexpectedly, the semi-transparent gray shadow that was about to collide with the soul-devouring flower's sprout suddenly twisted, curving around Caddy's hand and lunging straight for his wrist. Caddy's hadn't expected Saul's soul attack to be so agile. Soul attacks were driven by mental force, but once the energy left the body, it was notoriously difficult to control, often even more rigid than physical attacks. This was because a wizard apprentice's mental force couldn't truly leave their body. At most, it could be used to sense external magic or soul energy via vibrations. And yet, Saul had just pulled off a mid-air turn on a soul attack over 10 meters away from his body. This was far beyond the scope of what normal wizard apprentices could do. Gritting his teeth, Cadiz refused to retreat. One misstep would lead to another. He had to correct his earlier mistake before Saul escaped. Even if his arm got damaged by the soul strike, he was determined to deploy the soul-devouring flower. At the final moment, he twisted his wrist so the sprout in his palm faced the oncoming gray shadow. He pretended to reach forward recklessly, but in truth, he was maneuvering the sprout to make contact with Saul's magic and mental force. I just need to complete the marking. Even if I get hurt, I'll lie back and enjoy watching that brat get ravaged by the soul-devouring flower. Cadiz's lips curled into a smirk. The next moment, the gray shadow landed on Cadiz's wrist. At the same time, the green sprout in his palm made contact with Saul's soul attack. Cadiz braced himself for pain, but when he looked down at his arm, he was dumbfounded. What am I even seeing? A storm of question marks exploded in his mind. He watched in utter disbelief as the gray shadow pulled something out of his arm. That's right, quite literally. He saw a semi-transparent arm being dragged out from his still fully clothed, fully intact physical arm. In that instant, Cadiz finally understood. This was a piece of his soul, being forcibly extracted from his body. Gahhh! Cadiz let out a scream, his face going deathly pale. He had seen soul-targeting magic before, but never anything that ripped someone's soul out. And he wasn't just some ordinary person. His soul form was supposed to be exceptionally stable. Then he saw the gray-white shadow twist again and yank even more of his soul arm out of his body. Only now did Cadiz clearly see. The thing pulling on his soul wasn't a claw or hand. It was a gray, semi-transparent octopus tentacle. Tracing the tentacle back, he was stunned to find that it extended from Saul's sleeve, his actual hand nowhere in sight. Another strong tug rocked Cadiz's entire body. His mind went hazy, his vision doubled, and Saul's figure swayed back and forth, splitting and merging as if reality itself was coming apart. Cadiz had never experienced this before, but he knew what it meant. This was the precursor to having his entire soul ripped out alive. His eyes darted desperately to the corner of his vision. Now, all he could hope for was that the soul-devouring flower would kick in. If it couldn't seize control of Saul, at least it might block his next attack. But what Cadiz didn't know was that the soul-devouring flower was already trying its best to attack Saul. The moment the sprout touched Saul's soul form, he felt a strange mark appear within his consciousness. But before he could even begin to analyze what it meant, the diary floating silently within his soul core suddenly opened, swooped down to the mark, and then, smack! It clapped shut on the mark like a book crushing a mosquito. Saul stared blankly for a moment, then resumed his assault on Cadiz's soul body. His arm had transformed into a tentacle, which now tightly ensnared Cadiz's soul. With that complete, it was time for the next step, just like pulling a stubborn turnip. "Gotta admit, he really is a third-rank apprentice," Saul muttered, gritting his teeth as Cadiz's expression turned more and more dazed. "If this were a second rank, I could have yanked the soul out in one go, but with a third rank, I had to." A vein bulged on Saul's forehead as he gave another powerful jerk. Finally, a fully transparent figure separated from Cadiz's body, flying straight toward Saul along the tentacle's momentum. Cadiz's physical body trembled, then collapsed limply to the ground. 4 times. It took 4 pulls to rip his soul out. Watching the stunned, half-bewildered expression on the soul flying toward him, Saul raised his other hand. In the air, he grasped a dark red diary between 3 fingers and brought it before his eyes. The next moment, the soul was sucked into the diary without the slightest resistance, vanishing into its pages as a streak of black. Saul lowered his hand, flipped the diary over, and with a flick of his thumb, the pages rustled until it stopped on a brand-new black page. Not bad. The first confirmatory offensive test on the mental realm produced a satisfactory result. Saul gave a faint smirk and snapped the diary shut with a smack. Chapter 294, The Land Drifter's Sign. Although Saul had fallen into an ambush, the diary had issued a non-lethal warning, letting him know that the enemy this time wouldn't be too strong. At the very least, when he directly faced their attacks, the diary hadn't popped out to slap him with a reality check. He wasn't in a rush to check the new soul within the diary. Instead, he walked over to the corpse and crouched down, inspecting the pale green sprout in the enemy's palm. At that moment, the diary within his soul body opened once again, automatically flipping to the page associated with Herman. On the black page, milky-white writing appeared, somewhat messy in layout, reflecting the urgency of Herman. Master, I know this person. He's a newly promoted third-rank apprentice of the Land Drifters, specializes in earth element magic. His name is... Clearly, Herman couldn't remember. Forget it if you can't remember. Saul casually picked up a dry twig from the ground and poked at the sprout in the corpse's palm. Do you know what this is? Is it a magic tool or his personal spell? Neither, master. This is one of the 3 types of demonic creatures raised by the Land Drifters, a soul-devouring flower. A demonic creature raised by the Land Drifters, Saul repeated softly. The Land Drifters rose to power exactly because of their methods for raising these 3 types of demonic creatures. As one of the former top third-rank apprentices of the Land Drifters and a former captain of a frigate, Herman naturally knew them well. He even knew some of the deeper secrets behind the organization. He proceeded to explain the 3 types of demonic creatures. The first and most numerous were the Slender Wraiths. They served as the enforcers of the Land Drifters. Their necks could stretch hundreds of meters, making them excellent at tracking and observation. Since their true forms were shadowy apparitions, they could also slip into places others couldn't. Saul had previously encountered a Slender Wraith. Back then, he had just reached the 2nd rank and had almost lost his life to one in Hanging Hands Valley. He only managed to survive by relying on his phantom eye and little algae for a counterattack. The second type of demonic creature the Land Drifters raised were the Thousand-Eyed Banshees. Their bodies were covered in eyes. When concealing most of them, they could pass for ordinary beauties. But once they opened their eyes, they could emit dazzling rays of light that interfered with mental energy flow. With so many eyes open at once, they could see into areas or things invisible to ordinary people. Thousand-Eyed Banshees were far rarer than Slender Wraiths. Most of the time, only true wizards from the Land Drifters had access to them, unlike the Slender Wraiths, of which any third-rank apprentice might have one. The final and rarest were the soul-devouring flowers. It was said that the entire Land Drifters organization possessed only a single original flower. What was used here was merely a seed from it. These seeds generally couldn't develop over time and were considered one-time use items. I just noticed, when this seed came into contact with my soul body, it left a mark in my mental space. Is that how the soul-devouring flower works? That's a marking function, just one of the soul-devouring flower's most basic abilities. Once marked, both the seed and the original flower retain the imprint, allowing for tracking. If the mark matures, it can even affect your mind, master. Saul blinked. To what extent can it affect me? Could it alter my memories? Not that powerful. Otherwise, the Land Drifters wouldn't be just a merchant-type wizard organization. So it wasn't on the same level as the Nightmare Butterfly. Makes sense. If the Land Drifters had access to the creature at a Nightmare Butterfly level, they could easily rival the Wizard Tower in power on the Western continent. Saul nodded. Does this seed still have any use? It still contains some energy, but its marking seems to have been erased by your diary, Master. Herman was actually a bit shocked. Usually, unless Saul actively used the diary or allowed them to emerge, they couldn't perceive anything happening in the outside world. But before engaging this Land Drifter's apprentice, Saul had deliberately activated the diary, letting the four souls act as his advisors. They hadn't disappointed him. Herman had immediately recognized the man as one of the Land Drifters, and even urgently warned Saul not to touch the soul-devouring flower sprout. He was just a moment too late. Saul's tentacles still made contact, but nothing happened. The instant the seed left a mark in Saul's mental space, it was squashed by the diary. This made Saul realize, if he truly wanted the four of them to serve as combat advisors, they not only needed to understand the enemy, but also needed a better understanding of his own capabilities. Otherwise, they could easily provide inaccurate or even harmful intel. But that could be arranged later. A pale yellow root tendril rose from underground and tapped the tip of Saul's boot. Looks like the guest in the Black Castle has been taken care of too. Saul motioned for little Algie to wrap up the intruder's corpse and turned toward the castle. The Devil Vine performed pretty well. Herman, Master, that might be because the slender wraith lost its controller. Its combat power would have dropped sharply. Saul, though. Inside the diary, the noisy Agu nearly smacked himself in the face and quickly jumped out. Agu, Master, the main function of the Devil Vine isn't combat. It's mainly for surveillance and early warning. Those who guard the Black Castle, whether it was you or Machi Machi before, are all very powerful wizard apprentices. Ordinary intruders shouldn't be a problem. In case of truly overwhelming threats, you can request aid from Borderfall City or the Wizard Tower. Herman, why yes, Master. Saul, however, asked curiously, but when Lady Yura made me the temporary master of the Black Castle, she never told me how to contact the Wizard Tower or Borderfall City. Do you think it's because she didn't have time, or she didn't want to? A brief silence fell among the souls. Agu, Master, I'm not too familiar with the situation here at the Black Castle, but over the years it has always been able to contact the Wizard Tower remotely. It's just that most of the time, messages were sent from the tower to the castle, not the other way around. Possibly because the cost of initiating contact is too high. In the end, it was the usually quiet one who spoke up. And, Master Tilda, I actually know a little about Lady Yura's situation. By this time, Saul had already returned to the Black Castle. The front doors opened automatically, revealing a mess inside. Long-necked heads and dark green vines tangled together, some hanging from the walls, others draped across the floor. Most of the vines and heads had stopped moving. Only a few tendrils still slowly twisted and writhed, seemingly struggling to recover from the earlier fight. What do you know? Saul casually nudged aside the heads and vines, blocking his path with his foot, sounding rather indifferent. And I know that Lady Yura specialized in dark element magic during her lifetime, and she had a fondness for cultivating demonic creatures. The Devil Vine beneath the Black Castle and the soul-devouring mire beneath the Wizard Tower were originally planted by her. Saul's step faltered. He didn't complete the stride. Squishy. He stepped on a shriveled head and crushed it flat. Chapter 295, Old Affairs. So, even little Algie was planted by Lady Yura. Little Algie seemed to hear Saul calling for it. It slowly poked its head out from behind Saul's neck, looked left and right, and upon realizing Saul was simply standing there in a daze, floated around to face him and stuck out its tongue with a plurr sound. Saul swiftly raised his hand and pinched little Algy's upper and lower jaw together, accurately making it bite down on its own tongue. He watched its black tongue twitching violently before letting go with a light chuckle. Little Algy's grotesque face was forcibly interrupted and even turned into a toy by Saul. Furious, it shrank back down, but before retreating fully, it made sure to put some distance between them and stuck out its tongue at Saul again. While playing around with little Algy and explained to Saul, the soul-devouring mire was, in essence, an earth-elemental demonic creature. Calling it planted might not be entirely accurate, but it was indeed part of Lady Yura's dowry when she came. Agu, the former librarian, came out to confirm this. Agu, that's right, Master. Not long after Lady Yura arrived at the Wizard Tower, she opened up an underground lab and began cultivating many demonic creatures, but most of them failed to thrive. After Lady Yura's death, the underground lab was abandoned as well. And unwilling to be outdone, flipped to another page in Agu's book. And Master, I was still a living apprentice at the time. I happened to live through the dark days following Lady Yura's death. That day, the Tower Master flew into an enormous rage hiss. Saul could tell that and still felt fear when recalling that time. And many people died that day. Some were wizards from the Kema Duchy, others were wizard apprentices. We had never seen the Tower Master so enraged. Not until evening did we hear whispers that someone had seen the Tower Master carrying Lady Yura out of the underground lab. But Lady Yura's head was already gone. What he was holding was only a headless corpse. After that day, the underground lab was abandoned. Saul rubbed his chin and suddenly said, "Little Algy had been staying in that lab all along, and even after it was abandoned, it didn't leave. Do you think it might know how Lady Yura died?" The topic had shifted from whether Lady Yura had deliberately set Saul up to the cause of her death. But it wasn't off topic. If he could figure out how Lady Yura died, maybe he could understand what she wanted now. And maybe even figure out what Gorsa wanted. Saul knew the last bit of his History Watcher ability wouldn't last many more days. He had originally planned to use that last bit on the diary. Then he considered using it on the close companion, little Algy. Now, suspecting that little Algy might know the cause of Yura's death, Saul made up his mind. After dealing with Black Castle, he would observe little Algy's past. In any case, using that bit of History Watcher on the diary again probably wouldn't reveal much. Saul had already given up on a third observation of the diary's history. Still, aside from observing little Algy's past, there was another way to uncover the reason behind tonight's ambush. Tonight we've already welcomed the first guest and caught the second guest. Then I wonder, will there be a third? Dragging the corpse of the land drifter's assailant, Saul stepped down into the underground wine cellar, then entered the tunnel leading toward the Devil Vine's root system. "We meet again, Lord Saul." The moment the Devil Vine sensed Saul's presence, it quickly sent a greeting. At the same time, thick black tendrils, each as wide as a thigh, sprouted from the damp, muddy ground. They swayed gently as if greeting Saul. "Devil Vine, how many years have you been under Black Castle?" "I don't have a clear sense of time." "Then do you know how Black Castle communicates with the Wizard Tower?" "I'm sorry, I don't know." Saul wasn't exactly disappointed. He tossed the attacker's corpse to the ground and leaned casually against the wall. In his mind he commanded, "Diary, bring out that attacker's black page." The diary unfurled within his spiritual form and flipped to the 5th black page. "What's your name?" "My name is Cadiz. I'm a third-rank wizard apprentice of the Land Drifters. Where is this place? Strange, I don't remember how I got here." "Your purpose in coming here." Saul had no intention of keeping Cadiz. Maintaining these soul fragments required Saul to expend mental energy. If he didn't question them, the fragments could linger longer. But what would be the point of keeping a fragment that held no valuable information? Besides, Caddy's role overlapped with Herman. But Herman, now promoted to frigate captain, held far more value and knew much more. I was following orders from my mentor, sent to mark someone named Saul, a prospective third-rank apprentice. But I guess I failed. How am I supposed to explain this to my mentor? Prospective, third-rank apprentice. Saul flexed his wrist. Not many people know that. Lady Yura is one, and Grand Duke Kira probably figured it out. Some of the third-rank apprentices from the Kamaduchi might have noticed too. After all, unlike second-rank apprentices, third ranks not only had locators, but could perfectly integrate them with their soul forms. Their soul stability was leagues beyond that of regular second ranks. After some thought, Saul continued, "Do you know why your mentor wanted to mark Saul?" My mentor said I didn't need to know. What? So you really were just a pawn, didn't even know the goal of the mission. Then how were you supposed to mark him? Just let the seed of the soul-devouring flower come into contact with his soul form. That would do it. And after the mark was planted, did your mentor give you any further instructions? If the task succeeded, I was to leave a mark at the entrance of the Black Castle forest. Then someone else would naturally come to take over the mark. But I definitely planted the mark. Why did it fail? Could it be that the seed's energy ran out? So there was a third person. But the diary hadn't issued any warning this time. Saul quickly figured it out. To lure out the third person, the mark needed to succeed. But with the diary around, that mark couldn't stick, which meant the mark would always fail and the third person would never show up. Still, since Saul was able to extract the full story from Caddy's, the absence of the third person wouldn't lead to anything disastrous. With that thought, Saul finally felt more at ease. He hadn't yet cataloged or experimented with the diary's new alert system, so he wasn't sure what kind of negative consequences would trigger it. It might be something with a longer time delay, like eventual death, but even longer likely just meant a few hours instead of a few minutes. Based on the diary's previous behavior, Saul estimated that danger had only shifted from within minutes to within hours. If someone does take over the mark, what might they do? Saul suppressed his urge to begin experiments and continued the interrogation. I don't know. This was my first time handling a soul-devouring flower seed. Before this, I was just a bottom-tier third-rank apprentice. My mentor only recently promoted me. Saul rubbed his temples. This Caddy's really doesn't know anything, huh? What did his mentor promote him to? A disposable pawn. Chapter 296, Inferno Within. After answering a few disappointing questions, Caddy's white ink had already faded from its original pale color to a near gray, the strokes so thin and broken that they could barely be read. Seeing Saul's displeasure with Caddy's answers, Herman immediately jumped in. The diary flipped forward 2 pages. Herman, Master, I know a bit more about the soul-devouring flower. Speak. Saul couldn't be bothered to ask one question at a time anymore. When the seed of a soul-devouring flower leaves a mark inside a person's or other creature's soul body, the mark can gradually grow stronger under deliberate cultivation, eventually allowing the host to be controlled. While it won't alter someone's memories like you feared, it can indeed cloud one's mind temporarily, or apply a powerful influence at a critical moment, forcing the host into a specific action. However, the content of that action must be etched into the seed before the mark is planted. The cultivation process only strengthens this influence. It's like a mental suggestion, Saul nodded, his tightly furrowed brows slowly relaxing. It can influence someone subconsciously to carry out a specific act. Looks like I was just a tool land drifters wanted to use. As a near third-rank apprentice, Saul wasn't disappointed. If everyone had treated him like a true wizard instead, that would have been a reason to be nervous. Also, there's another use for the mark detonation. If detonated directly inside the target's soul body, it can cause significant damage. Short-term control, momentary manipulation, and detonation. This soul-devouring flower really is powerful, with a wide range of functions. No wonder it's one of Land Drifter's trump cards. If the seeds weren't so rare, their organization wouldn't be this small. Just then, Agu jumped in again. Agu, Master, though the soul-devouring flower seems powerful, it has many limitations. It's even less effective on true wizards. To influence a true wizard even slightly, you either need the flower's main blossom or a long period of cultivation. Besides, your diary can devour the mark the instant it's detected. Other true wizards, while not as powerful as you, surely have their own ways to erase the mark. True, Saul nodded. The mark isn't exactly subtle. Anyone with soul power at the level of a true wizard can detect it easily. Unless this third party Caddy's mentioned has a way to conceal the mark's presence, it'll still raise my suspicion, and I'd report it to the Tower Master. If Saul hadn't bound the diary as his locator before entering Black Castle, he might not have noticed the mark immediately. When that third party arrived to take over, so long as they didn't pose an immediate lethal threat, he really could have ended up unknowingly under control. If he brought that mark back to the Wizard Tower and carried out some act at a critical moment that caused great harm to the Tower Master, Saul knew Gorsa wouldn't forgive him. Whoever was targeting him clearly knew he was strong. They sent a third-rank apprentice to ambush him and used the slender wraith, delivered by Wizard Barry, to slip past the Devil Vine undetected. This person not only knew Saul fairly well, but was also quite familiar with Black Castle. The more I think about it, the more suspicious Lady Yura becomes. Saul crossed his arms, tapping his fingers rhythmically on his arm. Beside him, the Devil Vine found it odd that after Saul asked it 2 questions, he simply stood there, face shifting constantly. But having been nearly drained dry by little algae, it dared not speak out of turn. If I was marked, then to ensure the soul-devouring flower's influence lasts or activates at a critical moment, the person maintaining the mark would need regular contact with me, meaning they must be someone from the Wizard Tower. Saul suddenly stood straight, his eyes spinning with thoughts. Wait, maybe I can. He quickly had the diary flip back to the page with Caddy's. Caddy's, before and after you attacked me, did you speak with anyone about our fight or its outcome? And no. The weakness in Caddy's handwriting was obvious. So, you didn't manage to complete the marking. That means only you and I know about this. Yes. A faint smile curved Saul's lips. The Inferno within Experiment Step 1. Can I simulate the mark? The diary within his mental space suddenly spat out a dim, dull imprint. Saul recognized it at once. It was the exact mark the soul-devouring flower seed had left in his mental body. He immediately activated it with his mental power, making it flicker with ease. Perfect. The mark's authentic, indistinguishable from the real thing. I was thinking I'd have to mimic it myself with mental power. Didn't expect the diary to just give it to me. Now, can the diary decipher the embedded influence within the mark? Unfortunately, this time the diary gave no response. Saul wasn't discouraged. He clapped lightly. Either way, I've got the mark. He looked back to the diary. Now, Caddies, what kind of mark did your captain want you to leave at the entrance to Black Castle Forest? After answering Saul's final question, Caddies' faint, nearly invisible handwriting finally broke off. The black 5th chapter page in Saul's mental space shattered and vanished, the fragments burrowing away to unknown places. Devil Vine, can you check if there's anyone watching the entrance to Black Castle Forest? I can't monitor areas that are far away. "Is that so?" Saul smacked his lips. "Then I'll handle it myself." He stepped forward, hand poised to press on the devil vine. Wait, Lord Saul. I'll do my best, I'll try. No, I can do it." Saul's hand stopped just a centimeter from the devil vine's main root. Though he was threatening it, in truth he felt relieved that he wouldn't have to engage in another plant-mind communion. "This concerns my safety going forward. Please look carefully." "Yes, yes, of course." 10 minutes later, at the entrance to Black Castle Forest, a blood-soaked figure stumbled toward the forest. As he neared the entrance, he nearly fell, catching himself on a tree trunk and leaving behind a blood-streaked, pale green sprig. Then he turned and staggered off in another direction, vanishing into the dark woods. About an hour later, a patrol squad passed by the forest on their way back to Borderfall City. At that moment, the lead knight noticed a faint bloodstain on a tree trunk. "Go check it out," he said casually to one of the soldiers. The chosen soldier looked reluctant. Regular folk like them had no desire to get involved with the Wizard Tower. It wasn't like they could gain anything, and it was far too easy to just disappear forever. This soldier, though, was lucky. He approached cautiously, tiptoeing to peer at the mark, stretching his neck while keeping his body at a safe distance. Once he saw clearly, he dashed back. "My lord, there's a partial blood handprint on the trunk. The nearby ground shows some broken branches, and based on the footprints, whoever it was didn't leave the forest. There's also a bit of blood on the ground." The soldier gave his report seriously, not noticing that the knight's eyes were fixed on his collar. A tiny, blood-stained, pale green sprout had landed there. "My lord, should we report this?" "No need." The knight tugged his reins, leading his horse forward slowly. "Looks like just another commoner who wandered into Black Castle Forest. People who break the ban like that, if they die, they deserve it." Chapter 297. Aboard the ship. A few days later, a secret message traveled from the Borderfall City to the desolate plains. A strange, massive vessel sailing across the land. Two men standing in the eye of the storm. "Cadiz has already planted the mark. We can notify the people inside now," said one of them calmly. This sudden change of plans was rushed. "Cadiz still hasn't returned. Could there be a problem with the mark?" The other man frowned. The first man shook his head. "The blood on the new sprout of the soul-devouring flower is fresh. Cadiz might have been injured in battle, maybe seriously. That could be why he hasn't come back. But even if he died out there, it doesn't matter. Once the mission was done, he was no longer needed." "What if he got captured by people from the Wizard Tower? Could he leak our plans?" "Relax." Before sending Cadiz out, his mentor already planted the soul-devouring flower's mark deep within his soul. Even under the harshest torture, he wouldn't be able to recall anything about the soul-devouring flower. "That's a relief. I suppose the flower's powers are still reliable. So you guys plan to abandon him from the start, huh? Doesn't it pain you to lose a third-rank apprentice for nothing?" The first man turned his head to look at the second. He had a short beard covering his face, but if one observed closely, they would see the hair squirming subtly. The second man lowered his head under that gaze. "Are you testing my resolve?" The bearded man seized the second man's head and forced it down toward him. "When I, Wilder, say something, I mean it. Since we've signed the agreement, I'll follow through, even if it means sinking the entire crew of the Land Drifters." Wilder, the captain of the Land Drifters, the only true second-rank wizard in the organization. Because of Wilder's motion, their faces were now very close. It should have been an intimate distance that might even make a man uncomfortable. But in the next second, Wilder's beard suddenly writhed and lengthened, piercing deep into the other man's flesh. Drops of blood gathered on the man's face and neck, sliding down with wet splashes onto the ship's coarse wooden deck. Then seeped through the cracks. The second man trembled all over. He wanted to speak, but his lips were already sewn shut by Wilder's beard. When he tried to open his mouth, only a black mesh of threads could be seen between his teeth. His bloodshot eyes stared up desperately, begging Wilder with his gaze. But Wilder didn't look at the bloodied man. His gaze remained straight ahead, focused on the rising sun at the edge of the desert. In his eyes, it looked more like a sunset. Only when the man in his arms began to weaken in his struggling did Wilder finally let go. Remember this, when everything is done, I'll marry Kiera and become the new king of Kema. Whatever happens in Kema afterward, none of you are allowed to interfere. The released man collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling as he touched his face like it were rough sandpaper. As the pain surged now that Wilder's beard had withdrawn, his voice came out in broken fragments. Why, yes, everything. Everything according to the three-party agreement. Wilder nodded. Good. Then I'll head back now. I need to report this as soon as possible. Get lost. Once the second man scrambled off the ship like a kicked dog, Wilder's eyes remained fixed on the sun. Is that Saul really so important? I heard even Gorsa, who almost never leaves the wizard tower, once personally came to pick him up. Another man stepped onto the deck. Wilder didn't look back. That's why we're very interested in the boy, but every attempt to contact him has failed. Gorsa seems intent on protecting him. The newcomer rubbed his fingers together. I feel an urge to destroy anyone Gorsa favors. Wilder said indifferently, Aruba, you'd better not act on your own. If you ruin the plan, I won't even be the angriest person involved. The second prince of the Kinas, Aruba, was also their best hope of advancing to a second-rank wizard. Unfortunately, his recent advancement attempt had failed, leaving him injured. He used the excuse of recovering in seclusion to secretly come aboard the land drifters. After all, some recovery methods weren't convenient to perform within his own country. I know. I wouldn't want to be the one who takes the heat from all those folks who have been bottling up their fury toward Gorsa. Haha, I'm just curious. If one day, Gorsa discovers that the disciple he so carefully nurtured ends up becoming the guillotine that cuts off his own head, I wonder if he'll still be able to smile. Gorsa's real reason for going out that time wasn't to pick up an apprentice, you know, Tilda. Suddenly, a teasing voice cut into their conversation. Who's there? Aruba's face darkened as he turned toward the voice. But Wilder remained calmly staring at the rising sun. Just then, a silver-haired, handsome man with a frivolous expression slowly emerged from the blinding light of the sun. He was casually holding a harp in his hand, dangling it as if it might slip from his fingers at any moment. Wilder's gaze was already fixed in the direction where Kismet appeared, as if he hadn't been watching the sunrise, but rather waiting for the silver-haired man to step into the sun's halo. Who are you? Aruba had never met Kismet, but seeing how composed Wilder remained, he knew the two must be acquainted. Just someone irrelevant. Kismet landed on the deck and waved the harp at Aruba. At the sight of the instrument, a memory flashed through Aruba's mind, his failed advancement attempt. The scene had something to do with a harp too. He'd already executed all the musicians involved in that performance, though it had only barely eased his frustration. The sting of failure still hadn't fully faded even now. Judging by the silver-haired man's attitude toward Wilder, Aruba suspected this newcomer was also a second-rank wizard. He pushed those memories aside and adjusted his tone slightly. You're also a guest of the captain. Kismet leaned back against the railing and placed his harp on a bulging plank of wood. I'm just here to watch the show. You said earlier that Gorsa had another reason for going out. What was it? Wilder frowned, growing impatient now that Kismet had started chatting without finishing his earlier, more intriguing point. Kismet turned his head and lightly plucked a string with his pinky. A clear ting rang out. He went to meet an old friend. On his way back, he saved his little apprentice in passing. Who did he meet? Wilder's voice was tinged with concern. An old friend of Gorsa's might disrupt their plans. A half-elf. Shock. Both Wilder and Aruba showed clear changes in expression. The atmosphere instantly turned tense. Will this half-elf interfere with our plans? Wilder pressed on. Not at. Kismet raised a finger and wagged it. You all know how hard it is for a half-elf to live peacefully in this world. She wouldn't make a move for anyone. Besides, every time a half-elf takes action, it weakens her connection to this world. And once that link becomes too faint, she'll disappear like the other elves. Even if she won't act lightly, how can you be sure her relationship with Gorsa won't interfere with our plans? Aruba asked. Kismet turned his head again to face Aruba with a playful smile. Because that half-elf is also an old friend of mine, Tilda. Chapter 298, Confirmation. The captain of the land drifters looked at Kismet and finally asked the question that had long lingered in his mind. This long-lasting agreement, we all know what we want. I know what I want, what they want, and what Keena's wants, but I've never been able to figure out what you want. Don't be so tense. I don't need any resources. All I want is a good story. You know, music without ups and downs just isn't worth listening to. Wilder didn't trust his words so easily. Even though the land drifters only operate on the western continent, we've carried travelers from all over. And from their mouths I've heard your name, the harbinger of death. It's always accompanied by death. Kismet tilted his head and showed a helpless expression. Can't be helped, I suppose. Maybe it's because I'm always tied to partings and loneliness. That's just the main theme of my fate. Aruba frowned slightly as he stared at Kismet. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the way this man spoke. So he changed the subject. What does Gorsa want with that half-elf? How would I know something like that? But it's definitely not a secret rendezvous with a lover. Wilder narrowed his eyes at Kismet, clearly not buying it. Sure enough, Kismet added, but ever since he met that half-elf, he's switched from focusing on the light element to the darkness element. Wilder's eyes narrowed further. Are you saying that half-elf is connected to Gorsa's plan to resurrect Yura? Aruba clenched his fists. Then isn't she more important than that apprentice? Can we control her? No sooner had Aruba said it than Kismet and Wilder both gave him a complicated look. Wilder simply skipped over Aruba's question. Can we pull the half-elf to our side? Kismet shrugged. You might not be able to afford the price. The ones who benefit the most will naturally pay the biggest price. Wilder chuckled, the stubble on his face trembling with the motion of his muscles. Didn't you show up today just to be our go-between? Kismet strummed his harp strings and lowered his head with a soft laugh. I'm just passing through. What? After Kismet left, Wilder remained deep in thought, mulling over the new information about the half-elf. Aruba, who hadn't dared to speak much earlier, stepped forward and lowered his voice. Is this Kismet really trustworthy? Could he be working with them? Wilder shook his head. No, that three-way agreement wouldn't have happened without him putting in serious effort. But didn't you say he doesn't want anything? Then what's he after? I don't know. Rumor has it that his presence always heralds large-scale death. I suspect everything he's doing might be part of his attempt to advance to third-rank wizard. Third rank? Aruba suddenly felt bitterness rising in his throat. All the pride he held in his youth had been worn down by the harsh struggle of advancing again and again. The kingdom might hold him up as a symbol of glory, but Aruba, standing among true geniuses, couldn't help but feel anxious. Especially after his recent, inexplicable failure to advance, it had hit him hard. He had fled from Keena's to the land drifters not just to recover from his injuries, but also to clear his head. Ever since he got hurt, he'd been haunted by nightmares. In those dreams, he was always playing the harp, playing until his fingers bled, his flesh peeling away, yet still unable to stop. And then he would look down and realize he wasn't playing a harp at all. He was plucking at his own ribs, one by one. A flicker of anxiety returned to Aruba's face. He quickly took his leave of Wilder and left the deck, perhaps off again to vent on some woman. Wilder glanced at Aruba's retreating figure with disdain, snorting through his nose. After a while, he suddenly asked aloud, "Did you catch Kismet's emotional hue?" A jelly-like creature appeared on Wilder's shoulder, chameleon-like in its ability to shift colors. It was glowing green, with a single large eye that spun rapidly. Upon hearing Wilder's question, it made no sound. It simply turned its head and stared directly into his eyes. Without hesitation, Wilder thrust a hand into his eye socket and gouged out his eyeball, blood vessels and membranes still trailing from it. He casually tossed the eyeball into the open mouth of the strange creature. That was his companion sprite. He had named it Gleamdrake. The name was grand, though Gleamdrake itself was just a weak little sprite with an odd appetite and a few quirky abilities. After swallowing the freshly harvested eye, Gleamdrake didn't even chew. Wilder watched as his left eyeball floated inside the sprite's translucent body, tinting its bright green glow into a murky brown-red. Like a rotting, mold-infested swamp. Satisfied, Gleamdrake stopped staring at Wilder's other eye and let out a high-pitched cry. Croak! Only Wilder could hear it. He's excited. Wilder stroked his bristly chin, the hairs obediently flattening beneath his touch. Every time Kismet gets excited, a great number of people die. Could this blood-sail town curse be connected to him too? After being ambushed by caddies of the land drifters, Saul had shut the gates of Black Castle and withdrawn the devil vines from the forest. Dark green tendrils burst from the ground and coiled around the Black Castle like a giant snake, wrapping a thin, long-bodied man. Within the eternally gloomy forest, Black Castle gave off a soundless wail. Anyone passing by the foot of the mountain would feel a stabbing chill and dizziness. This once again spread fearsome rumors of the Black Castle throughout Borderfall City. And naturally, such a full defensive stance drew the attention of his allies. So just 2 days later, Barry returned once more. This time he didn't ride in a carriage, but galloped to the castle atop a tall, brown warhorse. Unfortunately, when he arrived at the gates and announced himself, all he received in return were the rustling of leaves and the chill wind swirling at the door. "Lord Saul," Barry calmed his steed, trying to ease its tension, and called out again to the temporary master of Black Castle. A long silence passed before the gates of Black Castle creaked open. Barry let out a breath of relief, quickly dismounted and stepped onto the porch. But the moment he saw what was behind the door, that breath he just exhaled was sharply sucked right back in. "Lord Saul, I saw signs of battle in the woods. Are you all right?" There was no sign of Saul behind the door, only dense, writhing vines like a mass of serpents. Saul had sealed the gates entirely with the devil vines. "Disappointed to see I'm still alive, Barry." Saul's raspy voice came from somewhere behind the twisting foliage. Barry's expression grew solemn. "Lord Saul, if you have any doubts about me, just speak them plainly. I don't know what you've been through, but as the liaison between the Kemaduchi and the Wizard Tower, I am responsible for all my actions. I hope you can give me a chance to explain. If you're still uneasy, I can notify other wizards from the duchy, or even Grand Duke Kira himself." The interior of the gate was silent for a long time. Barry spoke again, "Or I can go directly to the Wizard Tower." Saul's voice finally returned, still hoarse. "That won't be necessary. The new master of Black Castle will arrive soon. Until then I won't see anyone. I won't say anything. Leave." Barry sighed. He knew Saul was likely suspicious of him now, but without communication, there was no way to clear his name. He took a step back, descending the stairs. "Very well, but I hope that when the new master arrives, you'll grant me a chance to explain. We each represent the Wizard Tower and the Kemaduchi. A misunderstanding between us could damage the alliance and only serve the true enemy." There was no response from Saul. The massive doors slammed shut. Barry looked troubled as he took another step back and turned to leave. But just as he turned, a falling leaf was swept up by the wind and brushed past the corner of his lips. And in that fleeting moment, Barry's lips curved up ever so slightly. When the leaf was gone, the faint smile disappeared without a trace. Confirmed, Barry thought. The mark is in place. Now the next phase can begin. At the same time, inside Black Castle, Saul turned around with a look of amusement. Confirmed, Saul thought. Barry and Cadiz are working together. Let's see what their next move is. Back to back, separated by the massive gates of Black Castle, the two men walked away in opposite directions. Chapter 299, Little Algy's History. After confirming that Barry had ridden away from Black Castle Forest, Saul returned to the main route of the Devil Vine in the basement. Ever since he was ambushed by the land drifters, he had relocated here to study and research. This was the most defensively secure part of the Devil Vine, and it also made communication with the plant far easier. After placing a mark using the fresh corpse of Cadiz, Saul had been waiting patiently for someone to take the bait. He believed that as long as Cadiz failed to report back, someone would inevitably come to inspect whether the mark had been completed. That person could be someone he knew or someone he didn't. And since Cadiz's attack, only Barry had shown up at Black Castle. Of course, Saul hadn't jumped to conclusions so easily. When he sensed Barry approaching the front gate, he deliberately opened the door but made sure not to let Barry see him. As he listened to the man's voice, brimming with grievance yet trying hard to stay composed, he felt the mark within his spirit, already baptized by the diary, suddenly flicker. At the same time, Saul sensed a mental force probing through the Devil Vine, scanning his direction. Even if he questioned Barry, the man could easily offer an explanation. He was merely concerned about Saul and used his mental force to check on the castle. Having confirmed that Barry was a problem, Saul decided not to communicate further. The longer the interaction, the higher the risk of exposing the flaw in the mark. Barry had likely gotten the confirmation he needed. Now it was only a matter of waiting for the one who cultivated the mark to appear. While waiting, Saul didn't stay idle. He continued delving into Touch of Torment while trying to integrate his soul-fishing ability into this second-rank spell. Soul-fishing was a technique he had developed by altering his soul's state into that of an octopus's tentacle, allowing him to absorb others' soul forms. His second body modification had already enabled his skin to absorb the soul. In addition, he possessed the Death Wizard's Diary, an item that could dominantly devour both soul and consciousness. The fusion of these two powers had produced a terrifying ability, capable of ripping a soul straight out of the flesh. Of course, the strength of the enemy Saul could fish depended heavily on the strength of his own soul form. At his current level, he could easily fish up an ordinary third-rank student. But if the target was particularly skilled in soul-related magic or possessed strong protective magical items, his attempt could still fail. This was Saul's external strategy to defeat enemies, built upon his own abilities and golden finger. He also had an internal tactic for defeating stronger foes within his mental realm. However, this method was still in theory, as two key problems remained unsolved: how to construct the mental realm stably and reliably anywhere, anytime, and how to drag an enemy's soul consciousness into it. Thus, the internal mental battlefield was still just a concept. After encountering Barry, the third-rank wizard apprentice, and confirming him as an enemy. Saul had intentionally given the impression that he'd been implanted with a mark during his fight with Cadiz. A cultivated mark once triggered can briefly throw someone into confusion or force them to follow a subconscious command. As for me, there are only two things worth this group's scheming: my identity as Gorsa's apprentice and the diary. But the diary seems less likely. So far, the only one who knows about its existence is Kismet. From my interactions with him, it seems like the diary isn't his goal. Still, that guy has deep ties to it. His true motives are unclear for now. For the moment, I'll just wait for the enemies to surface on their own. Saul turned to look at little Algie. This creature had completely taken over the Devil's Vine's territory. Now, half the basement was filled with black tendrils that gleefully stretched upward every day. The white mushrooms Saul had once seen in the passageways were now completely gone. Occasionally, he could even hear what sounded like the Devil's Vine sobbing. "Little Algie," Saul called out to the creature perched behind his neck. Little Algie answered immediately, stretching its head toward Saul. Its shark-like mouth opened wide, tongue lolling out as it made playful noises. "Pulararu." Saul reached out to pinch it, and little Algie quickly dodged away. Ever since Saul had twice clamped its tongue between its jaws, little Algie had become obsessed with the game of "you can't catch me." "You win," Saul said with a smile, beckoning little Algie over. Little Algie approached with its usual lack of caution. "In a bit, I'm going to perform an experiment on you. Be good and don't move." Little Algie bobbed its head up and down. Saul could faintly feel that the mysterious ability he had obtained from the nightmare butterfly, History Watcher, was about to fade today. These past few days, stuck inside Black Castle, he hadn't found a better target to observe. So today, he decided to observe little Algie. But the problem with an ancient, demonic creature was its potentially long and dull history. Saul didn't want to activate the power only to watch scenes of little Algie eating, drinking, and other mundane activities. He needed to test whether he could lock onto a specific period or individual within its memories. Saul lifted his hand and patted little Algie on the head. "Little Algie, do you still remember Lady Yura, the one who once planted you beneath the wizard tower?" Little Algie stopped its gleeful movements for a moment, then hesitantly nodded. "Then in your memory, do you recall any scenes where you saw both Tower Master Gorsa and Lady Yura at the same time?" Little Algie's body began to tremble slightly. "So there are, and they may not be pleasant memories," Saul sighed, stroking little Algie's head again. "I'm sorry. I want to know what really happened back then so I can figure out what they're planning." With that, Saul activated his mental force, channeling it into his eyes. His black pupils instantly turned silver. In his vision, little Algie transformed into a deep black mist, enveloping everything. In the next moment, the mist parted, and Saul found himself inside a brightly lit laboratory. The lab had a peculiar but familiar layout. It was large, but the floor all around was covered in black mud. Only the center featured a raised stone platform. On the platform stood two long experiment tables, cluttered with various tools and materials. Between the tables was a recessed rectangular space. The shape of the recess resembled a coffin. The vision shifted to focus on the coffin-shaped space. Inside it lay a golden-haired woman of extraordinary beauty. The moment Saul saw her, he recognized her identity: Lady Yura. As he looked into her eyes, the woman suddenly opened them. Their gazes met in midair, and Yura smiled radiantly. "You're here," she said. The vision moved upward, shifting behind Saul. He saw a man standing in the shadows of a suspended hallway along the wall. Tall and slender, the man stood quietly. Then, in a flash, he appeared beside the coffin recess, standing on the edge of the platform, looking down at Yura. "Was that you just now?" the man asked gently. His unkempt gray hair hung over his eyes, and his silver pupils shimmered with warmth. Seeing those slightly curved eyes as the man smiled, Saul immediately recognized him. Tower Master Gorsa. So this is what the Tower Master looked like before he mummified himself. He resembled a scholar or a doctor, mild in temperament. Gone was the eerie aura of the Big Pink, who wandered under the light. Chapter 300. The experiment failed. Yura smiled and reached out her hand, but Gorsa didn't take it. Instead, he bent down and directly picked her up in his arms. She seemed quite pleased with this and chuckled. "Were you startled? Don't worry, I've prepared plenty. That way, we can start the experiment without any hesitation." The way Yura looked at Gorsa was filled with joy. But in the very next second, she eagerly jumped down from his arms and walked over to one of the long experiment tables. "Of course, before we begin, we'll need to prepare a lot of companion flowers. I borrowed some seeds from my sister, but for a bulk order, you'll have to reach out to the land drifters." Yura picked up a sheet of paper from the table. From Saul's current perspective, he couldn't see what was written on it. But he could clearly see Yura's expression. If just a moment ago, her gaze as she looked at the Tower Master was dancing with delight, now, as she stared at the white paper in her hands, her eyes burned with a fierce fire. Through her trembling hands, Saul could directly sense her fanaticism and excitement. "We can begin very soon." However, Yura's sentence was abruptly cut off halfway through, because the man behind her suddenly struck with his hand like a blade, slicing off half of her head. Blood splattered across the entire experiment table as Yura's body twitched and collapsed. Gorsa, his face equally splashed with blood, gently held onto the upper half of her severed skull. After a moment of silence, he suddenly let out a sigh. The experiment failed. Saul was instantly gripped by a chill, unable to breathe. In the next moment, black mist once again enveloped his vision. But when the mist cleared, Saul realized he was still within the historical memory of Little Algae. This was a different fragment of the past. The same strange laboratory surrounded by black soil. This time, Saul immediately noticed that Gorsa had grown even thinner. His hair was longer and more unkempt, as though quite some time had passed since the last memory. He walked to the center platform and leaned down to lift a woman from a rectangular groove. It was Yura's corpse, missing half her head. She was no longer bleeding, but the muscle tissue at the point of separation still looked fresh. Gorsa gently placed her on the now empty experiment table. First, he tenderly removed the clothes from the corpse, revealing her pale, graceful body. Then Gorsa raised his hand. Between his thumb and forefinger, a tiny blade, 3 centimeters long, quietly appeared. It was an extremely sharp and thin blade. It trembled ever so slightly in sync with the twitching muscles of Gorsa's hand. Suddenly, the trembling stopped. Gorsa leaned in once more, placing both his hand and the blade at the edge of Yura's skull. Very carefully, very tenderly, he began to peel the skin. Black mist shrouded the world once again. When Saul opened his eyes, he saw Little Algae wagging its tongue like a happy puppy. Across from him, a massive black tentacle swayed toward the ceiling, and a devil vine sat surrounded by dozens of writhing tendrils, looking somewhat aggrieved. He had returned from the vision. Perhaps because Little Algae's level was far lower than that of the diary, Saul was able to see much more in its historical fragments using the last of his History Watcher ability. He patted Little Algae's head, letting it roam freely. Stretching out his arms, he worked out the stiffness in his limbs. His gaze drifted through the air, thoughts spinning around what he had just witnessed. The Tower Master killed Lady Yura and even peeled off her skin. These two scenes perfectly match what Yura told me. From that, it appeared that Yura had not lied. But Saul still had doubts. In the first memory, Yura had clearly said they were about to start an experiment. Yet Gorsa had cut off her head and claimed the experiment had failed. What exactly was this experiment they spoke of? And were they both referring to the same experiment? Regardless of their individual positions, one thing Saul could be certain of. The current Yura truly hated Gorsa. But due to Gorsa's overwhelming power, her hatred could only manifest in sarcastic complaints and her erratic temperament. Still, what really lay between them wasn't fully revealed in this piece of history. Perhaps Gorsa had killed Yura, but based on the inconsistencies in their words and behavior, it was also possible that something had gone wrong with Yura. Saul pinched the bridge of his nose. A headache was setting in, not pathological but physiological. The world before his eyes was always fog wrapped in more fog. Every time he tried to uncover the truth, he found it hidden beneath yet another lie. So what was the truth? Saul wasn't all that concerned with who killed whom, but it was clear that he had now been drawn into the eye of the storm. He was already rank 3 and about to officially join Gorsa's research project. He had to understand what it was he was meant to study, whether it might lead him straight to the guillotine. Although the diary's danger alerts had slowed from every few minutes to every few hours, or even days, he couldn't always rely on it to guide him forward. Especially after the appearance of Kismet, the sense of crisis had deepened. So Saul had been working hard to strengthen his connection with the diary, exploring its abilities, and integrating it with his own body modifications and primary magic. If one day I lose the diary, Saul paused mid-thought, then let out a carefree laugh. Well, no point in thinking about that. With how tightly we're bound now, if I lose the diary, I'll die without a doubt, so there's no need to worry about it getting stolen. Having exhausted the last of his history watcher, Saul committed all his unanswered questions to memory and returned to his studies. Half a month passed in that same tense, yet monotonous atmosphere. During that time, Barry seemed intent on proving his innocence and came to visit Saul again. Saul still met with him from behind the devil vine-woven wall, exchanged a few words, but made no promises. His answer: "I'm just the temporary master. I don't have the final say." And then this temporary master went right back to bullying the native resident, Devil Vine, alongside little Algie. Barry didn't come again after that, finally giving Saul a bit of peace and quiet. So when, half a month later, someone knocked on the door of Black Castle again, Saul didn't immediately realize that it might be the new arrivals from the Wizard Tower. At that moment, he was midway through calculating a formula and didn't want to stop. So he had Devil Vine check who was at the door. If it was Barry again, Saul planned to pretend he didn't hear anything. But Devil Vine's report was that the visitors were indeed from the Wizard Tower. A man and a woman had stepped down from a carriage. Saul tossed his pen aside. Finally, someone's here. He turned toward the black tentacles cheerfully wriggling on the floor and said, "Little Algie, pack them all up." Little Algie, knowing they were about to return to the tower, obediently pulled all the tentacles back into its body. The previously cramped underground space suddenly felt much more open. Devil Vine cautiously stretched out its aerial roots, seemingly in disbelief that it had finally reclaimed its territory. "It was a pleasure to accompany you during this time, Lord Saul." "Likewise," Saul said, barely suppressing a grin. He strode out of the underground chamber to the front gates of Black Castle. Just in case, he didn't open the door or even remove the Devil Vine barrier inside. "May I ask who's there?" Saul deliberately lowered his voice, making it sound tense and ominous. "Your old buddy, you idiot."